It began with fire, and it ended in ice. Stalingrad, 1942. The city that bore Stalin's name and became the tomb of the German Sixth Army, the turning point of the Second World War, and the most brutal single battle in human history. For 6 months, men fought not just for streets or buildings, but for every shattered brick, every stairwell, every inch of rubble. They fought in cellars and factories, across frozen rivers, and beneath skies blackened by smoke. By the time the guns fell silent in February 1943, more than 2 million souls were dead or missing. The Volga River ran thick with blood, and the city itself, once alive with music, industry, and pride, lay in ruins so complete that even the dead seemed to vanish into the dust. Stalingrad was not merely a battle. It was the moment when fate itself shifted. The road to Stalingrad began with victory. In the summer of 1942, Germany stood at the height of its power. From the gates of Leningrad to the deserts of Africa, the Nazi war machine seemed unstoppable. Hitler's armies had taken Kiev, Kharkov, and Sevastopol. To the world, it appeared the Reich had conquered the continent. But in his ambition, Hitler turned his gaze to the east once more, toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, and toward a city that carried symbolic weight far beyond its strategic value. Stalingrad was not just a name on a map. It was Stalin's city, the heart of Soviet pride. To capture it would humiliate the Soviet leader and shatter the morale of an entire nation. What began as a campaign for resources soon became an obsession, a duel between two men, two ideologies, and two worlds. As the German Sixth Army advanced across the steppe, they met little resistance at first. The air was hot, the skies clear, and the land seemed endless. But by August, the city's skyline appeared, a sprawling maze of factories, smokestacks, and tenements stretching along the Volga. The Luftwaffe struck first, reducing the city to rubble in days. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, entire neighborhoods erased in a storm of fire and steel. Yet from that ruin rose defiance. The Soviet defenders, soldiers, workers, and civilians alike, dug in among the debris, turning every wall into a fortress. The German blitzkrieg, designed for speed and maneuver, was swallowed by the ruins it created. Tanks could not advance through mountains of brick, streets became killing grounds, snipers ruled the shadows, and the air itself seemed to choke with dust and smoke. For the men inside the city, Stalingrad became a living nightmare. The front lines shifted by the hour. Buildings were captured, lost and recaptured dozens of times. Soldiers fought with bayonets, knives, shovels, even bare hands. The factories of the Red October and the barricadi became citadels of resistance, echoing with the thunder of artillery and the screams of the wounded. Amid the chaos, names like Vasily Chuikov and Vasily Zaitsev became legends, symbols of the unbreakable Soviet will. Across the river, the Volga ferries brought reinforcements under constant bombardment. Men crossed the water, knowing they might never return. And still they came. There is no land beyond the Volga, the Soviet command declared, and the defenders made that vow real. By autumn, the city was a graveyard. The German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, pressed forward relentlessly, convinced that victory was within reach. They captured 90% of Stalingrad, driving the Soviets to the river's edge. Hitler declared the city won, but beneath the surface, the Red Army was preparing its trap. In November 1942, under the biting cold of the Russian winter, the Soviets launched Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that struck the German flanks, held by weaker Romanian and Italian units. The assault was swift and devastating. Within days, the German Sixth Army was encircled. 300,000 men trapped inside the city they had nearly conquered. The hunters had become the hunted. As the winter deepened, the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The soldiers had no winter clothing, no supplies, no hope. Food ran out, ammunition dwindled, horses were eaten, men froze to death in their trenches, their rifles frozen to their hands. The Luftwaffe tried to resupply the army by air, but the scale was impossible. The snow-choked skies swallowed the planes as fast as they came. Inside the ruins, discipline crumbled. Starving soldiers fought over scraps. Wounded men were left to die in cellars filled with ice and shadows. Still, Hitler forbade retreat, declaring that Polis must stand to the last man. But there were no more men left to stand. By late January 1943, the Sixth Army had ceased to exist. On February 2nd, Polis surrendered. The once proud German army, 300,000 strong, had been reduced to fewer than 90,000 frostbitten survivors, most of whom would never see home again. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. From that frozen city on the Volga, the Red Army began its relentless push westward, through the snows of Russia, across the plains of Poland, all the way to Berlin. The price was almost beyond comprehension. Over 2 million dead, soldiers and civilians alike, their bodies buried beneath the ruins of a city that no longer existed. Stalingrad was more than a victory or a defeat. It was the breaking of a spell, the moment when Nazi invincibility dissolved into myth, when the tide of history turned in the blood and ice of a ruined city. It stands today as a monument to endurance, to sacrifice, and to the terrible cost of total war. For those who fought there, it was not strategy or ideology that kept them alive. It was the simple will to endure another hour, another breath, another dawn. Tonight we walk through those ruins once more, through the smoke, the cold, and the silence that followed. This is the story of the Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of World War II, where a city refused to die and where the fate of the world was decided in the ashes of the Volga. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The Volga moved slowly under the soft breath of summer. Its wide surface shimmered in silver and ash, carrying the quiet of distant villages and the hum of unseen insects along its banks. Barges drifted lazily between reeds, their wooden hulls creaking like old voices, remembering better years. On the horizon, the city that bore Stalin's name lay wrapped in haze. Not yet a battlefield, not yet a ruin. To the west, the steppe shimmered beneath the weight of heat, holding its breath for something vast and nameless. The war had already devoured half of Europe, yet here the river seemed untouched, indifferent, eternal. Fishermen cast their nets with the same patience their fathers had known, pretending not to hear the thunder of engines that grew stronger each day. Above them, the air carried a stillness that felt too perfect, too exact, as if nature itself were waiting. Each ripple on the Volga caught the light like a fleeting thought, then vanished into the slow current of time. And far away, the sound of marching feet began to echo beneath the water's calm. In Moscow, orders had been given, and in Berlin, maps were marked with lines that sliced through the land like wounds. Yet here, near the bend of the Volga, life continued in measured rhythm. Trains sighed, children chased shadows, factory whistles called the faithful to labor. The city was proud, built on endurance and defiance, with chimneys that touched the clouds and streets that bore names of revolution. Workers spoke of new machines and production targets, not of the armies moving toward them. They trusted in distance, in the slow geography of rivers and plains. But the wind carried news faster than messengers, whispers of encircled armies, of cities fallen like dry leaves. The people of Stalingrad did not yet know that they lived at the mouth of history's most voracious hunger. Every street, every courtyard, every quiet window was already being written into a story of loss and endurance. And the river, slow and wide, carried their reflections as if trying to remember them before they were gone. To the south, German columns rolled eastward beneath banners that caught the sun in flashes of red and black. Dust rose from the earth in ghostly spirals behind them, as if the land itself recoiled from what was coming. Soldiers laughed in the heat, confident that the war would soon end in triumph. They carried photographs of home pressed into books and wallets, unaware that many would never see those faces again. Radios in the trucks hummed with music, bright, mechanical tunes that tried to drown the weariness of endless movement. The officers spoke of oil, of rivers, of strategy. But the men thought only of survival and sleep. The closer they drew to the Volga, the more the landscape seemed to flatten, as if preparing them for the vastness ahead. From a hilltop near Kaluk, one could see the faint glint of water, a silver thread winding through dust and heat. For many it looked like destiny itself, stretching quietly to the horizon. And still the Volga waited, patient and unmoving, as if it had seen such things before. Summer lingered like a held breath. The fields beyond Stalingrad were full of wheat, bending gently beneath the wind, their gold reflecting the long light of evening. The farmers worked in silence now, watching the skies as much as the soil. Some had already sent their families eastward toward the promise of safety. Others stayed unwilling to abandon what generations had built. The air smelled of harvest and smoke, not the smoke of war, but of cooking fires and burning straw. Yet in that sweetness was a taste of fear, faint and metallic, like iron in the water. At night, distant flashes on the horizon began to appear, silent but unmissable. They said it was just the front, far away. But the front had a way of moving faster than anyone expected, and every night the river's surface reflected the light of distant storms, pretending they were only thunder. In the barracks across the steppe, Soviet soldiers cleaned their rifles beneath dim lamps. Some were veterans from the long retreats of the previous year, their faces carved by exhaustion and disbelief. Others were young, barely trained, their hands still soft from factory tools and schoolbooks. They spoke of home, of the river, of the smell of bread cooling on windowsills. Letters arrived, then stopped arriving. The older men knew what that meant and said nothing. Rumors drifted like smoke. The Germans were unstoppable, their tanks invincible, their bombers unending. Yet in the silence of the barracks there was also a kind of peace, the stillness that comes before the inevitable. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in long, gentle waves, and in that quiet, the soldiers felt the river calling them eastward, though they did not yet know why. Far to the west, generals drew arrows on maps that curved toward Stalingrad like claws. Each arrow meant movement, encirclement, and fate. In command tents, the language of conquest replaced the language of life. Divisions became numbers, rivers became lines, cities became targets. But maps could not capture the slow-beating heart of the Volga, nor the souls that lived along its banks. As dawns passed, the sound of engines replaced the songs of birds. Villages emptied, the old left behind, the young conscripted. The great war machine rolled forward, blind and certain. Yet even within its steel, men prayed, not for victory, but for an end. And over the rumble of war, the soft murmur of the river could still be heard, whispering of things that outlast all empires. By late August, the air had changed. The heat began to fade, replaced by the first cool winds that hinted at autumn. Leaves along the river's edge turned brittle, their edges kissed by dust and smoke. The city stirred uneasily, aware now that the storm could no longer be ignored. In the factories, women worked through the night, casting shells and repairing tanks beneath flickering bulbs. Children carried buckets of sand to the rooftops, to douse the fires that everyone knew would come. The hum of warplanes was no longer distant. It was a pulse overhead, constant and low. The horizon glowed faintly red each night, as though the sunset refused to end. And as the first bomb fell, the river did not flinch. It simply reflected the fire and kept moving east. The Volga had seen centuries of conquest. Mongols, Tatars, empires rising and fading into dust. Yet never before had it looked upon such resolve, or such sorrow waiting to be born. The fishermen were gone now, the boats pulled ashore, all shattered by the shock of nearby explosions. The water carried fragments of wood, torn fabric, drifting smoke. Across its vastness, the sounds of war began to echo, the thud of artillery, the distant cry of men. But between each sound, there was still silence. Immense, unbroken, ancient. That silence would soon be shattered, yet for one last moment, it held the world in fragile balance. The city beyond the river was still standing, its factories still alive, its people still breathing. And as the river glimmered beneath the dying sun, no one yet knew that its waters would soon carry ghosts instead of fishermen, and that the city beyond would become a graveyard of empires. In the summer of 1942, the earth itself seemed to shimmer under the weight of marching boots. From the forests of Ukraine to the edges of the Don River, German columns stretched endlessly across the steppe, ribbons of dust marking their passage beneath the pale sun. Engines hummed with mechanical certainty, and the soldiers moved with a rhythm that had not yet known failure. The fields were dry and yellow, offering no resistance, no shadow, only horizon upon horizon of wind-bent grass. Maps told them this was destiny, the next step in a victory already imagined. To the men it felt like the world had been laid open for them, wide, golden, and fragile. The radios played songs from home, and for a time the voices of singers drowned the low growl of the advancing war. Each town they passed seemed to fall away, like a page turned too easily. Behind them the dust closed over the memory of what once stood. And ahead, the road led deeper into the brightness, where the mirage of conquest flickered and waited. Operation Blue, Fall Blau, as they called it, was not merely an attack, but a dream of empire drawn in fuel and fire. Hitler's gaze had turned toward the south, where the oil of the Caucasus glistened like liquid gold in the imagination of his generals. To control it would be to choke the Red Army's heart, to cut off its pulse forever. He spoke of rivers and mountains as if they were already conquered, as if their silence meant surrender. His armies, strengthened by victories across the continent, believed in that silence. They saw only open ground, easy movement, and the gleam of destiny. Yet beneath that confidence was a quiet blindness, a faith that the earth itself would not resist. The Soviet forces had retreated, yes, but not vanished. They watched and waited, invisible within the folds of the steppe. And as the Germans pressed forward, the horizon seemed to bend, drawing them farther from what was real. By July, the offensive moved with a terrible grace, tank divisions rolling like tides, infantry following in measured lines, aircraft circling above like patient hawks. The report spoke of success, of rapid advances, of victory just ahead. In headquarters, maps filled with arrows that curved toward the Volga, each one drawn with the confidence of inevitability. But every arrow hid the same truth. The line was growing longer, and behind it the lifeline of supply grew thinner. Trains stretched to breaking, convoys faltered under heat and distance. Soldiers grew weary of the sun that never seemed to set on their march east. Some began to feel that they were chasing something too vast to ever be caught. Yet orders were orders, and momentum like a current carried them on. And far behind, the wind began to erase their tracks as if the steppe itself doubted their return. The rivers became milestones of progress. First the Don, then the Volga beyond it. Each crossing felt like a triumph, a step deeper into legend. Yet with each mile, the world seemed to widen instead of shrink. The sky grew larger, the distances longer, and the air thinner, dry as powdered stone. The soldiers rode in open trucks, faces covered in dust that turned them all the same color, gray, anonymous, ghostly. They joked about the endless steppe, about the strange silence of the villages they passed. But some nights when engines cooled and the stars returned, they whispered of unease. The land was too quiet, the air too still. Somewhere ahead, an invisible resistance was forming, patient and unbroken. And beyond that invisible line, a city by the river waited with its own silent defiance. In the offices of Berlin, the word Stalingrad had begun to glow with strange importance. It was not the city's industry that mattered most, nor its roads, it was its name. To conquer Stalingrad would be to strike at the heart of Stalin himself, to break the will of the Soviet soul. To lose it would mean nothing short of humiliation. Thus, what began as a military plan slowly became something else, something personal. Commanders hesitated to question the obsession, though many sensed the danger in such symbolism. For Hitler, maps had become mirrors reflecting his own conviction. For his soldiers, the orders became chains, binding them to a fate none could see. And as the days grew hotter, the name of the city began to pass between them like a whispered prayer or a curse. Meanwhile, far behind the front, Soviet leaders read the German movements like omens. Stalin had withdrawn his armies strategically, allowing the enemy to stretch thin across the plains. The losses were immense, but space itself became his ally. Every kilometer the Germans advanced was another. They would one day have to retreat. Russian civilians dismantled factories, rail lines, entire cities, moving them east beyond reach. It was as though the land were vanishing before the invaders' eyes, leaving only emptiness and exhaustion behind. What the Germans saw as triumph, the Soviets understood as overreach. And though their armies still bled, their resolve was not broken. They knew that time and distance were ancient allies in their history of survival. And through the long nights, Soviet trains rumbled eastward, carrying the heartbeat of a nation that refused to die. The German high command soon noticed the change in rhythm. Supplies slowed, resistance thickened, and the endless steppe began to feel less like conquest and more like confinement. The soldiers grew thinner, their laughter quieter. Every mile farther east meant another bridge to defend, another road to repair, another promise stretched thin. Reports of Soviet regrouping near the Volga arrived like murmurs in the wind. Still orders came, forward, always forward. No one dared to suggest retreat. To stop was to doubt, and doubt was forbidden. And so they marched onward, deeper into the mirage, believing that victory still waited just beyond the next horizon. By late August, the sun hung low and red over the plain. Fields burned in the distance, filling the air with a sweet, acrid scent. The engines grew tired, the men slower, yet the promise of one last victory pushed them on. They spoke now only of Stalingrad, a name that pulsed through every radio, every briefing, every dream. The city shimmered ahead, unseen but ever present, like a memory they had not yet lived. Maps grew stained, voices grew hoarse, and still they moved east. The wind carried dust that settled on their uniforms like ash. The illusion of speed remained, but time itself had begun to slow. Beyond the clouds of dust, a single name began to whisper through German radio chatter: Stalingrad. Stalingrad lay upon the slow bend of the Volga, like a sleeping giant of iron and smoke. Its skyline was a forest of cranes and chimneys. Its breath, the constant hum of machines that built the lifeblood of a nation at war. To those who lived there, it was not merely a city. It was a symbol, a promise forged from labor and loyalty. Streets carried the names of revolution, squares held monuments to struggle and triumph. The scent of oil and metal hung in the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of the river breeze. In the early mornings the factories awoke before the sun, their whistles calling the workers like church bells of industry. They built tractors that became tanks, and tools that became weapons. Every spark in the foundry a heartbeat of resistance. Mothers and children walked beneath the glow of the furnaces, unaware that these same lights would soon guide the bombs. Life continued, proud and weary within the city of Stalin's name. And in the quiet between the engines, one could almost hear the rhythm of a nation preparing to endure. To Stalin, the city was more than geography. It was a mirror of himself. Born from revolution and rebuilt by his decree, it stood as proof of Soviet will made solid. To lose it would mean shame before the world, and humiliation before his own people. To defend it, no matter the cost, was to defend the myth of invincibility that held the country together. His orders were clear and cold, not one step back. In his office in the Kremlin, maps glowed red with markers around the city's outline, each representing men who would die to preserve its name. Yet, to the workers in Stalingrad, it was still home. Streets filled with laughter, market stalls with the last fruits of summer, children chasing each other through courtyards of dust. They did not think of glory, they thought of warmth, of bread, of the next day's labor. Their endurance would soon become legend, though none of them wished for legend at all. And above their rooftops, the wind carried the distant murmur of engines growing nearer. For the German command, the city's name was both a temptation and a challenge. Hitler saw it not as a strategic target, but as a duel, one name against another, one man's will against his rivals. He imagined the news headlines, the triumphal speeches, the collapse of Soviet morale. His generals, more cautious, warned of the danger of fighting street to street, house to house. But his pride had already chosen the battlefield. The armies moved toward the city like moths drawn to a flame, believing that taking it would end the war in the east. The steppe narrowed into valleys of brick and smoke, where open maneuver would soon become impossible. Still they advanced, certain that victory would come as swiftly as before. And in that certainty, the seeds of disaster were already being sown. Within the city, life pulsed stubbornly against the rhythm of war. Workers built trenches between shifts, hauling sandbags by day and sleeping beside them by night. Schools closed, and classrooms filled with crates of ammunition and sacks of flour. Hospitals overflowed with refugees from the Western Front, weary faces, hollow eyes, stories too heavy to speak aloud. Along the Volga, ferries carried wounded soldiers eastward and returned with ammunition, supplies, and new men to fight. Women took up rifles, students carried stretchers, old men stood watch with wooden clubs. The city moved as one living organism, wounded yet unwilling to fall. And beneath all the noise, the river kept its steady whisper, a reminder that the world still flowed onward, indifferent and eternal. But the air had changed. The stillness before impact had begun to tremble. The factories that once built machines for peace now roared with unending urgency. The tractor factory, the Red October mill, the Barricade works, these names would soon echo through history as fortresses of defiance. Day and night their chimneys belched flame, and their floors shook beneath the rhythm of hammers. Workers slept beside their machines, their dreams lit by the orange glow of molten steel. They knew the Germans were coming, yet none stopped working. The idea of surrender felt alien, almost shameful, as if the very walls would collapse from hearing it spoken. Outside, the smell of smoke thickened, but the forges still burned. Sparks rose like fireflies into the night sky, and for a moment the city seemed invincible. And in that belief, fragile and fierce, Stalingrad prepared to meet its fate. The Volga itself was the city's guardian, wide, ancient, and unyielding. It divided east from west, past from future, hope from despair. Barges drifted across its grey expanse, carrying supplies and soldiers under the shroud of mist. Sometimes the water was smooth as glass, reflecting the faint glow of the factories. Other times it churned with the roar of engines and the distant thunder of artillery. The people looked to the river for safety, though they knew it could not save them. Still, its presence offered a kind of comfort, an illusion of permanence amid the gathering storm. Fishermen who once cast nets now ferried wounded men, their boats heavy with silence. The Volga watched without judgment, carrying both the living and the lost. And as the horizon darkened, the first shadows of the approaching storm began to take shape. By early September, the enemy's presence could be felt like a vibration beneath the earth. Bombers appeared as small black dots above the haze, their engines pulsing like a heartbeat against the sky. The air grew tense, thick with dust and rumor. Radio spoke of the front collapsing, of German tanks within reach of the river. Still, the people of Stalingrad did not flee. Many had nowhere to go. Others refused to abandon what they had built with their own hands. They gathered their belongings, shared bread, and waited for whatever would come. Hope was not spoken of, only endurance. And as the hours passed, even endurance began to feel sacred. And in the stillness, before the first bombs fell, the city listened to the sky. When the first sirens wailed, they sounded not like alarm, but like prophecy. The roar of engines followed, rolling across the rooftops in waves of trembling sound. Windows shattered, and the air itself seemed to ignite. Yet even as flames rose, the people did not scatter. They moved toward the shelters, toward the factories, toward one another. For them this was not merely a battle for survival, it was the defense of meaning itself. Stalingrad was not just their home, it was their identity, their word for courage. As smoke thickened and light faded, they understood that the city's name would be written in history, one way or another. They would not fight for land, but for an idea, and every idea demands a terrible price. The sky over Stalingrad began to change with a slow inevitability, as if the day itself had grown too heavy to hold its own silence. The clouds were thin, ghost-like, almost delicate, and the air shimmered faintly above the roofs, trembling in the late light. Then from far beyond the horizon came a sound not of thunder, but of countless wings. Mechanical, deliberate, unending. People paused on balconies, in factories, in streets, each one sensing that something vast was moving toward them. The wind grew warmer, touched by a strange metallic taste, as though the air had forgotten how to breathe. Above the river, birds wheeled in confused circles, fleeing toward the east. Then came the first explosions, distant but clear, soft at first, like doors closing somewhere in the sky. Windows trembled, The earth answered with a dull echo, and the city's hum of work and life faltered. The sound was not one of war yet, but of an immense change beginning its first breath. And as the roar deepened, every street seemed to lean toward the sky, waiting for what could no longer be stopped. The first wave of the Luftwaffe came like a slow tide of iron across the heavens. Each plane, black against the sun, carried not just destruction, but the weight of a nation's ambition condensed into noise and fire. The people below looked upward, their eyes watering from the brightness, unable to grasp how vast the formation truly was. When the bombs fell, they did not fall in chaos. They fell in rhythm, as if the sky itself had learned to march. Dust rose, merging with smoke, wrapping the city in a single continuous breath of ruin. The factories glowed orange, then red, then black. Their chimneys split open like candles burned too low. Trees along the river bent without breaking, their leaves turning grey with ash. In the distance, the Volga glimmered faintly, reflecting the fires as if it too were burning beneath its calm. The noise seemed to erase all memory of silence, and in that endless sound, the city began to lose its shape, melting into shadow and flame. The people ran not out of panic, but out of instinct, their bodies guided by memory more than thought. Mothers clutched children, workers carried the wounded, and strangers helped one another as if kindness had suddenly become command. Streets became unrecognizable. Landmarks vanished beneath clouds of dust and rising heat. In the cellars, air grew thin, and voices soft, each breath a quiet act of persistence. Somewhere a gramophone played faintly, the record skipping through static, refusing to end. The sky above was red and alive, pulsing like a living thing, breathing fire through the cracks of roofs and windows. Time stretched, minutes became hours, and the mind lost its measure of what was real. The flames climbed higher, joined together, and turned the air itself into a trembling veil of heat. It was as if the day had forgotten light and learned only to burn. And through it all the people held each other, waiting for the noise to fade. By evening, the city no longer looked like a city. Its outlines had been erased, its corners softened into mounds of rubble that still glowed faintly beneath the falling night. The smell of dust and smoke settled thickly in the lungs, and even breathing felt like an act of endurance. The factories that had once sung with labor now whispered only in the crackle of embers. A river of sparks flowed through the air, carried by the wind, as if the stars had come down to wander the ruins. Somewhere dogs barked and then fell silent, replaced by the low creak of buildings, shifting as they cooled. The Volga gleamed with faint reflections of fire, its surface a long mirror of what had been lost. Across the water, the eastern bank was quiet, a dark ribbon untouched, for now. And as the wind carried the scent of burning iron, the city beneath seemed to exhale, as if relieved that the worst had finally arrived. Night fell not as rest, but as surrender to stillness. The survivors emerged cautiously, their footsteps muffled by dust that clung to every surface like snowfall. The world was pale and grainy, washed clean of color, as though life had been redrawn in charcoal. They moved through what was once familiar, tracing streets by memory rather than sight. A tram lay overturned, its rails twisted like vines reaching for the horizon. The air shimmered faintly with heat, but the sound of fire had softened now to a faint crackling hum. Somewhere beneath the rubble, a clock continued to tick, refusing to acknowledge the change. The people whispered as they moved, as if loud voices might disturb the ghosts already gathering. The city still lived, though it did not yet know how, and in that slow procession through ruin, there was a strange calm, not peace, but an acceptance that nothing would ever be the same again. The wind carried the faint echo of the sky's rage away, leaving only breath and dust behind. As dawn returned, the destruction took on the clarity of daylight. The skyline was jagged and thin, a silhouette of broken chimneys and fractured walls. Smoke drifted upward in slow spirals, pale grey against the soft blue of morning. Birds returned hesitantly, settling upon twisted beams, as if to test whether the world still held. In the courtyards, people gathered, their faces streaked with ash, but their eyes unbroken. They spoke little, their words too small to match what had happened. Yet life began again almost immediately. Fires were lit, water was fetched, wounded were carried to the shade. From somewhere the sound of a hammer began, slow, rhythmic, deliberate. It was the sound of a city refusing to disappear, and in that sound was the first promise that Stalingrad would endure. For the Germans watching from afar, the destruction looked complete, a victory written in fire and smoke. Reports described a city crushed, its industry erased, its people scattered. Photographs would later show only the vastness of ash, the illusion of triumph. But within those ruins, something had shifted. The city had become a labyrinth, its streets twisted into a terrain that no map could capture. What the bombers destroyed in shape, they had unknowingly given back in spirit. A fortress made of ruin. The Soviets who survived now had a city that could no longer be easily conquered, only entered at great cost. Every pile of bricks, every collapsed wall would become a line of defense, and behind those defenses a new kind of wall was waiting to be born. When night fell again, the fires still glowed, but softer now, less rage, more ember. The Volga reflected the dim orange light as though the stars had settled upon its surface. People slept in cellars and basements, huddled together, breathing in the warmth of each other's presence. The silence that followed was not relief, but something deeper, a collective pause between two storms. Above the city, the sky was empty once more, its vastness indifferent and calm. Somewhere beyond that darkness, new orders were being written, new plans made. The air was still thick with ash, but already the rhythm of war had begun to change. The fires had not ended the city, they had transformed it. From the ashes, Stalingrad was becoming something else, something unseen and waiting. From the ashes, the city's shape changed, no longer streets and homes, but shadows and rubble, perfect for ghosts to hide. The grain elevator stood like a silent monolith at the edge of the southern district, its tall concrete walls rising from the ruins like a monument to endurance itself. Once it had been a simple place of work, a tower that stored the harvest of the fertile steppe, a symbol of sustenance and routine. But now, stripped of peace, it became a fortress, a grey cathedral of survival overlooking the smoke-choked river. Its windows were shattered, its doors sealed with sandbags, and its floors lined with the footprints of soldiers who would never leave. From the outside, it appeared lifeless, but within, the echo of whispered voices and the faint click of rifles filled the hollow air. Dust drifted through the beams of light that broke through its cracked walls, turning every movement into something half-dreamed, half-remembered. The defenders who gathered here did not speak of victory. They spoke of holding, of existing 1 hour longer than the world expected them to. Their faces were gaunt but calm, marked by the stillness of men who had already accepted the impossible. Around them, the city burned, but inside, the elevator held its own silence, as if it had swallowed time. And within that silence, something sacred began to take root. They were no more than 50 men, a handful of factory workers, sailors and young conscripts, who had crossed the Volga under cover of night. Their uniforms were mismatched, their supplies scarce, but their will was bound by something larger than command. The belief that this single building mattered. From its upper floors one could see the wide river glimmering faintly beneath the haze, and beyond it the endless sweep of the steppe. Every morning the defenders watched as the horizon filled with movement, tanks advancing, infantry crawling, dust rising like breath from the earth. Yet inside the tower time stood still, anchored by routine and quiet ritual. They cleaned their rifles in the half-light, shared bread broken into uneven pieces, and marked the days not with calendars, but by the rhythm of survival. Each man carried within him a different reason to fight: a family far away, a comrade lost, a promise made to no one but himself. And as the hours folded into one another, the distinction between courage and exhaustion blurred into something timeless. They were alone, but they did not feel abandoned. The walls around them became their world, and the world became smaller, more precious, more real. Outside, the Germans advanced with confidence, believing the city already broken and its defenders scattered. They saw the tower as a formality, another obstacle to be cleared on the way to the river. Yet, as they drew closer, the air around the elevator began to shift. The quiet was deceptive, too still, too composed. When they reached its base, they found that the walls themselves seemed to resist them. The sound of each bullet swallowed into the concrete's depth. The elevator stood unmoved, defiant in its simplicity. Smoke rose around it, wrapping it in layers of shifting shadow, yet its outline remained steady, as if carved from the will of those within. The Germans shouted through the dust, their voices echoing up the tall, hollow interior, unanswered. For every step they gained, something intangible pushed back. The stubborn breath of those who refused to yield. The air grew thick with tension, and even the wind seemed to avoid the building's height. The elevator became not a structure, but a presence, silent and watching. Inside, the defenders spoke little. Their world had reduced itself to sound, to rhythm, to the echo of footsteps on grain-covered floors. The air was thick with the scent of dust and the dry sweetness of wheat that still clung to the walls. Light came in faint streaks through the cracks, fragile beams that moved slowly as the day wore on. Some of the men hummed quietly, half out of habit, half to keep the silence from becoming unbearable. They drank what little water remained, their throats raw, but their minds strangely calm. Each heartbeat felt louder than the noise outside, more real than the distant thunder that shook the earth. They lived from moment to moment, unmeasured by fear or hope. Even fatigue took on a different texture here. Less weight, more trance. The elevator had become both prison and sanctuary, holding its defenders in a timeless stillness. And in that stillness they found a strange, unwavering peace. At night, the world outside turned to ash and whisper. Flames flickered along the horizon. But within the elevator, the darkness was cool and steady. The men rested in shifts, listening to the wind threading through the broken windows. Somewhere in the distance, artillery pulsed like a heartbeat too large for the earth. They spoke of small things, of home, of rivers they had crossed, of what the air smelled like before the war began. A few laughed softly, though no one remembered why. Their voices blended into the night, rising and fading like the hum of insects. In those hours the building seemed alive, breathing with the rhythm of its inhabitants, its concrete lungs expanding with every whispered word. The night was not quiet, but it was kind. And in that kindness, the men began to understand that they were part of something that would outlast them. When morning returned, it came not with sunlight, but with smoke and dust, that dimmed the day to a colorless glow. The walls trembled, the floor shuddered, but still the elevator did not fall. The defenders had become shadows themselves, silhouettes moving through light and dust. They no longer counted hours, nor wondered when relief would come. The building had become their companion, its tall, narrow body absorbing their endurance and reflecting it outward. They could hear the enemy outside, voices raised in command, boots striking metal, but these sounds no longer carried fear. Each vibration through the walls was simply another heartbeat of the tower. The world beyond had become distant, almost imaginary, as though it existed in another time altogether. Here only breath and silence mattered, and through that silence the men began to feel the weight of something eternal, pressing gently against their hearts. Eventually, the Germans broke through the outer wall, expecting emptiness. What they found instead was motion, quiet, disciplined, ghost-like. The defenders moved with a calm that seemed unreal, their faces pale beneath the dust. For a moment both sides stood still, uncertain whether the other was entirely human. The air was thick with heat, yet coldness seemed to emanate from the concrete itself, as if the structure disapproved of intrusion. The battle that followed was not a clash, but an exchange of wills, a slow dance within the hollow body of the tower. And when it ended, the silence returned, deeper than before, heavy enough to swallow even thought. The Germans stepped carefully through the remains, unsure whether they had taken anything at all. The tower stood, wounded but unbowed, its walls bearing the memory of every breath that had passed within them. The elevator had not surrendered. It had merely changed hands, and the air inside still carried the faint scent of grain and courage. In the days that followed, the ruins of the grain elevator became legend. German reports spoke of supernatural defenders, of an impossible resistance that made mockery of reason. For the Soviets across the river, the story became a hymn whispered through the night, a symbol of what it meant to endure. The city had many strongholds, but this one stood apart, not for its height or its strength, but for the quiet devotion it inspired. The defenders were gone, yet their presence lingered in every crack and every shadow. The building itself seemed alive now, watching, remembering. It stood as a warning and a promise, its grey silhouette eternal against the smoke. For the Germans it was another obstacle. For the Russians it was proof that spirit could inhabit stone. The Germans thought they were taking buildings. They were stepping into tombs that could still breathe. The house stood on a corner where two streets met, its brick face carrying the echoes of ordinary life. Before the war it had been just a building among many, with families and laughter and the small rituals of daily living. Its windows had framed sun and snow, small curtains and the slow passing of seasons. When the fighting reached that neighborhood, the house became something else, a pivot in a map that no longer made sense. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov and his men arrived with little more than rifles, a flag and an understanding of what to hold. They cleared rooms slowly and deliberately, making places within places where breath could be kept safe. Neighbors helped with bread and kettle water, trading what little they had for the comfort of shared courage. Night after night they listened to the city and learned to read the language of distant guns. The building took their footsteps into its bones and returned them as a steady heartbeat. The house stood longer than the men inside it, and in its silence a new kind of waiting began. Inside, the men moved like a small, patient family. Their routine simple and precise. They cleaned weapons with the care of craftsmen and shared stories in whispers that kept the cold at bay. Food was measured and stretched, each crumb accounted for as if it were a promise to return. Letters were read in secret, names repeated softly, so memory would not fade. Some of the defenders had been workers, some sailors, some boys who had learned to measure the world by the length of a step. Their faces were lit by a single lamp at night, shadows sliding across walls like slow tides. Sleep came in short shifts, and sometimes in the hollow hours of dawn, when the city seemed to hold its breath, they wrote names on the inside of a doorframe, a map of what mattered more than geography. The house absorbed these marks, and kept them as if it were a ledger of survival. And as days lengthened into a pattern, those small rituals became the soft scaffolding that held them steady. Outside, the city changed its character from neighborhood to fortress in ways both visible and invisible. Streets became narrow rivers of movement where the living threaded themselves between rubble and memory. Snipers learned the language of windows and courtyards, and boots found new paths along broken tram lines. Sometimes the sound of a distant engine would draw a hush like tide pulling out to sea. Soldiers watched horizons with an intensity that made hours feel like minutes and minutes like hours. The house at the corner became a point of reference, a name spoken quietly in other basements, and in the lines of telephone operators. People began to map the city by the buildings that refused to fall, and Pavlov's house was among them. Mothers tucked children into cellars beneath its foundations, where the earth felt steady and old. Even the river seemed to shift its mood when told of the little house that would not yield. From within those walls the defenders watched the world change and learned to move with it. Reports of the house's endurance traveled quickly, soft as rumor, and then steady as fact. Soldiers and civilians began to speak of Pavlov's house as a symbol, a small miracle within a vast calamity. German patrols circled it with caution, noting its stubborn silhouette against the broken skyline. Within the house, men kept to their tasks, not because of legend, but because that was what had to be done. They repaired shutters, reinforced stairwells, and patched holes with planks of wood and blankets. A kettle burned constantly on a small stove, its steam knitting the air into a warm domestic thread. Children brought gathered berries and offered them in shy hands as tokens of gratitude and hope. The building's rooms echoed with the soft sounds of ordinary life that refused to vanish even in the loudest times. For those who came seeking shelter, the house became a measure of human constancy, and the story of its stand grew not as a boast but as quiet proof that small things could matter. The defenders were not heroes in the way songs made them, but people whose choices became meaningful by circumstance. They feared and hoped in equal measure, and their courage was born from the daily refusal to stop breathing. Sometimes a younger soldier would ask an older man how long they could hold, and the reply would come in a tired smile rather than a plan. They traded memories of past summers and winter harvests, reminding themselves of a life before smoke. Each morning they checked the stairs and the cellar, counting steps as if calibrating fate. When new faces arrived, they were welcomed with bread and a bed, given a role and a name in the house's quiet order. Stories were told gently, with pauses timed to the passing of distant artillery, so the listeners could breathe between lines. The men carved small icons from bits of scrap wood, gifts for those who would leave, and tokens for those who might stay. In quiet moments they would look out through broken windows and watch the Volga, seeing in its steady flow a rhythm that anchored them. Each day the house taught them new ways to keep hope small and steady. Outside attempts to dislodge the defenders came and went. Some hurried, some careful, none effortless. Soldiers found the house a complicated enemy, its rooms folding into one another and hiding movement with shadows and dust. When attackers tried to press in, the defenders answered with a calm coordination, learned through long hours and shared work. It was less a clash than a series of measured replies, each action searching for the quietest way to keep space. The concrete absorbed shouts and returned only the echo of breath, and in that echo the defenders found rhythm. Occasionally the house bore new scars, a collapsed stair, a jammed door, and every scar became a lesson in improvisation. Men learned to move silently through hallways, to pass messages with the lightest touch, to close a door as if sealing a story. In the evenings, someone would take a small candle and walk the rooms, lighting each in turn as a way of counting the living. The house responded with the same patient endurance it had always shown, holding the people like a cup holds water. And as seasons shifted, the building's steady presence became a map to which many returned. Over weeks, the house acquired a life beyond the men who first held it, becoming an emblem for those across the city who resisted in their own ways. Word reached other units about the quiet courage found in that corner, and new volunteers arrived to lend their hands. Supplies trickled in when possible, food handed over in hushed exchanges at dawn or dusk under watchful eyes. The defenders shared tools, mended clothing, and taught one another tasks until chores themselves felt like prayer. Nurses set up a small aid station in a back room, tending to wounded with methods learned from necessity and careful calm. The sound of a needle and thread grew familiar, a softer counterpoint to the far-off rumble of guns. Children who had been too young to understand war now grew up naming the rooms in the house and learning the paths that kept them safe. The house's fame spread as a quiet human story rather than a boast of military might. People wrote letters to those who had passed through its doors, leaving messages folded in the hollow of broken walls. Each note became a tether, connecting strangers together by memory and small mercies. Eventually the name Pavlov's house reached beyond the city and into the accounts of commanders and journalists who tried to make sense of the struggle. Some called it a fortress, others called it a miracle of stubbornness and luck. All called it a symbol of something larger than a single stand. Inside, the men continued their daily tasks, unaware of how their quiet labors had come to represent a hardship and a hope. They did not seek fame or a place in history, only the preservation of one more morning for the children and neighbors under their roof. When the house finally changed hands and its defenders moved on, the structure remained as a witness to the many small choices that had kept it upright. Later stories would soften and enlarge parts of the tale, yet those who had been there remembered differently, in simple, careful details. The bricks carried the traces of breath and whisper, and those traces lingered like a scent long after voices left. Pavlov's house taught the city that ordinary people could hold extraordinary things together, simply by staying. The myth of invincibility grew from these small acts, but the real lesson lay in the quiet labor of keeping a place for life to continue. Every room had a heartbeat, and every brick was baptized in fear. The house stood longer than the men inside it, and its echo moved across the city like a soft, resolute tide. By autumn, the battle for Stalingrad had lost its sense of direction. Streets no longer led anywhere, they simply dissolved into rubble, into stairways that climbed to nothing and doorways that opened into silence. The front line had ceased to exist in any traditional sense. It was everywhere and nowhere at once. Men fought for rooms, for floors, for hallways, no wider than a shadow. The city had become a maze of debris and dust, where every movement carried a whisper of danger. The Germans began to call it Rattenkrieg, the Rats' War, a struggle fought in tunnels, basements, and broken walls. It was a name born not of insult, but of weary respect, for both sides had learned to move unseen, to live beneath the skin of the ruined city. The air itself seemed to pulse with tension, a low hum of unseen motion and watchful stillness. Every corner was a boundary between life and silence. In Stalingrad, even the dust seemed alive, listening. The days were filled with echoes that had no source. Footsteps sounded from beneath the ground, whispers drifted through holes in walls, and shadows passed across staircases without ever revealing their owners. Soldiers learned to recognize each other by the rhythm of breath or the shape of a hand. There was no longer up or down, left or right, only distance measured by instinct and fear. The light was dim and colorless, filtering through clouds of smoke and the drifting flakes of plaster. Many stopped marking days altogether. The difference between day and night had lost meaning. Fires burned constantly somewhere in the distance, casting an orange hue that never faded. Men learned to sleep sitting upright, rifles across their knees, their dreams haunted, not by fear but by the absence of quiet. And so the war lost its horizon and became something that breathed through cracks and shadows. The snipers were the eyes of this new kind of warfare. They waited for hours, sometimes days, in the husks of buildings, breathing dust and watching through narrow slits. The most famous among them, Vasily Zaitsev, became a legend whispered through the ruins. His patience was endless, his movements measured as though he had merged with the debris itself. Each shot he took was less an act of violence and more an act of control. One moment of precision amid the chaos. To his comrades, he was a story that proved humans could still outthink fate. To his enemies, he was a ghost that erased faces from windows. His calm became contagious, spreading through units like a quiet resolve. Other snipers, German and Soviet alike, began their own duels, long silent confrontations that turned the shattered buildings into a chessboard of unseen minds. The city became a place of stillness and focus, punctuated by the brief, sharp whisper of a single breath released. The silence that followed each shot was often louder than the shot itself. At night, the city changed its language again. What had been ruins in daylight became living labyrinths under the moon, corridors of shadow and movement. Patrols crept through half-collapsed walls, their boots pressing softly against the rubble, as if walking on fragile glass. They communicated through touch and gesture, afraid even of their own voices. Every sound seemed magnified, the crack of brick, the slide of metal, the faint sigh of shifting dust. Flares hung briefly in the air before fading, their light leaving behind more questions than answers. Somewhere, a radio played a song from another world, its melody drifting through broken windows like memory. The men moved through basements filled with stale water, through tunnels that echoed like cathedrals, through spaces too tight to stand, and above them the stars watched cold and unblinking, indifferent to the movements below. In Stalingrad, no day began. It simply continued the night. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and strange. Dreams borrowed from reality and returned distorted, full of corridors that never ended, and rivers that ran uphill. Soldiers woke uncertain whether they had rested or only paused between two long awakenings. They spoke of the city as though it were alive, a being that inhaled their breath and exhaled fatigue. The wind that moved through the ruins carried both comfort and despair, cool on the skin, yet heavy with the scent of ash. Many forgot the sound of silence altogether. Even in moments of stillness, their ears searched for the hum of unseen movement. Meals became rituals of grounding, a piece of bread, a sip of water, a pause to remember what hunger felt like before it became permanent. Each man carried the war inside him now, a rhythm that matched the city's broken heart. They were both prisoners and guardians of a place that no longer belonged to either side. The line between man and ruin grew thin, and both seemed to blur into one endless shape. Every building became its own world. Some held both armies at once, one on the upper floors, the other below, divided by thin layers of concrete and chants. They could hear each other breathe, curse and cough through the floors. The tension was unbearable yet strangely intimate. like living with one's reflection. The fights for such spaces were slow and deliberate, more siege than battle. Soldiers used walls as maps, windows as traps, stairwells as bridges between living and dying. It was warfare stripped of spectacle, all instinct, no glory. The city itself seemed to favor no one, collapsing equally on friend and foe. The dust swallowed uniforms, made everyone the same color, the same weary shadow moving through the half-light. And in that sameness, the idea of victory began to fade into something quieter, the need simply to endure until the next breath. There were moments when the noise stopped completely, and in those moments the men realized how deep their exhaustion had become. The silence was not peace, but the pause between two storms. It pressed into their bones, heavy and soft, reminding them that they were still alive but not yet safe. In that hush, one could hear the soft crackle of fire somewhere distant, the drip of water through shattered pipes, the faint murmur of prayer. Time stretched endlessly, its rhythm defined only by heartbeat and breath. Some wrote notes they would never send, some hummed songs their mothers had taught them, and some simply stared into the dark, tracing the outlines of invisible memories. The city was filled with such moments, small, suspended pockets of humanity, surrounded by infinite ruin. They did not speak of them afterward, as if silence itself might break under the weight of remembering, and when the fighting began again, it felt almost like relief, a return to the rhythm they understood. As the weeks passed, both sides began to sense the futility of their labor, yet neither could stop. The war had become something that moved of its own accord, indifferent to exhaustion or reason. The men no longer fought for ground or glory, but because movement had replaced meaning. Each day was a repetition of the last smoke, dust, whispers, and the pulse of distant artillery. And still, amidst the madness, small gestures of life continued. A man lighting another's cigarette, a shared word about home, a glance toward the river, as if to confirm it still flowed. The battle for Stalingrad was no longer a clash of armies but of wills, a meditation written in smoke and breath. When snow began to fall, it settled softly upon the ruins, disguising the wreckage with a deceptive purity. For a moment the city seemed almost beautiful again, its sharp edges softened by white, but beneath that quiet surface, the war continued, patient, unseen, and endless. In the stillness of Stalingrad's broken streets, a new kind of battle took shape, one fought not with armies but with breath. The snipers became the unseen rhythm of the city, invisible threads woven through dust and silence. They waited for hours unmoving, their eyes fixed on fragments of light between the ruins. In those quiet hours, time thinned to a single heartbeat, stretched across the distance between life and death. Among them was a young man from the Urals named Vasily Zaitsev, whose calm precision would become legend. He had once hunted deer in the mountains, learning the patience of wind and the language of stillness. Now he hunted something far more elusive, another man doing the same thing on the opposite side of a shattered wall. The world around him had collapsed into angles, shadows, and glints of glass. He breathed slowly, deliberately, his pulse steady as the river beyond the city, and in that breath he found a strange and terrible peace that felt almost holy. Each morning began in silence, as if the city itself were listening for the first shot. The air was cold, sharp with frost, and the faint scent of brick dust. Zaitsev watched for the smallest movement, a reflection on metal, a ripple in a curtain, a breath too quick to hide. In the ruins, sound carried strangely. Even a single step could echo like thunder across empty rooms. He waited until stillness returned, until the world seemed suspended between one heartbeat and the next. His rifle rested against his cheek, like an old companion, its wood warm from his hand. Around him, the city seemed motionless, yet alive in ways that could not be seen. Sniping was not violence to him, but discipline, a study of human rhythm. His calm became an act of survival, a meditation learned through necessity. And as the day passed into dusk, he remained in place, as still and enduring as the walls that surrounded him. Stories of Zaitsev spread through the ranks like whispered prayers. Men spoke of him not as a soldier, but as a force of nature, part of the city itself. His name became a quiet reassurance, proof that someone somewhere was keeping watch. Each tale grew in the telling, blurring the line between myth and truth. Some said he never missed, others that he could wait 3 days for one shot. Even the Germans spoke of him with a kind of uneasy respect, calling him the ghost of the ruins. But Zaitsev himself did not think of these stories. To him the city was not a stage for glory, but a landscape of silence he had learned to navigate. He moved through it like wind through broken glass, invisible, patient, and inevitable. And in every silence there was the knowledge that someone else unseen was waiting too. The duel between Zaitsev and the German sniper who sought him, an officer trained with equal patience, became the quietest battle of the entire war. For days they hunted each other across the same few hundred meters of ruin, neither willing to move first. The world between them shrank to a chessboard of shadows, windows, and broken bricks. Hours stretched into days, and days into an eternity of breath held too long. Zaitsev measured the light with his eyes, the way the sun reflected off stone at different hours. He noticed how birds avoided certain roofs, how dust rose from footsteps that didn't belong to his own. Both men were experts in waiting, and both began to understand the other's mind, as if reflected through glass. The city watched them, though no one could see them. And when the waiting finally ended, there was no celebration, only silence. The silence that always follows an ending too perfect to explain. Sniping in Stalingrad became more than skill. It became a philosophy of survival. Each shot carried with it not just precision, but intent, a careful weighing of necessity against meaning. The men learned that patience was the most powerful weapon of all. They hid in ruins, chimneys, and drain pipes, finding beauty in stillness and truth in quiet. Some began to say that the snipers had become like the city, broken but enduring, watchful and eternal. For Zaitsev, the act itself became a kind of meditation, each motion deliberate and without haste. He thought of the mountains where he was born, the scent of snow and pine, the silence before dawn. In that memory he found strength, the reminder that life existed beyond the scope of his rifle. He never smiled when men called him a hero. He only nodded, as if acknowledging a story that belonged to someone else. And when he spoke, his words were few, but each carried the calm of a man who had lived too long inside quiet. Psychological warfare became as much a weapon as bullets or bombs. Both sides spread stories of invisible marksmen who could see through walls or hit from impossible distances. The myths multiplied, feeding fear as effectively as any gunfire. Soldiers began to imagine eyes in every shadow, the weight of unseen gazes pressing on their backs. Even the simplest task, crossing a street, lighting a cigarette, became an act of courage. The mind began to tire faster than the body, worn thin by invisible tension. Zaitsev understood this and used it carefully, not as cruelty, but as strategy, to unnerve the enemy without unnecessary waste. The true battle was not in shooting, but in waiting, in who could endure the longest silence. The line between hunter and hunted blurred, until even victory felt like surrender to something larger than both. Every silence hid a trigger. Every breath was borrowed time. The hunters were also prey. As autumn deepened, the snows returned and softened the ruins into pale shapes of ash and frost. Footsteps became muffled, echoes muted, and even the sharp crack of rifles seemed gentler in the cold. Zaitsev's unit grew, each man trained in his patient ways, spreading through the city like quiet sentinels. Together they became a network of watchers, keeping the fragile balance between chaos and control. The Germans, weary and cautious, learned to fear windows, doorways, and the glint of light on metal. The city was no longer theirs to command. It belonged to the silence that answered their every step. Amid the wreckage, crows circled slowly, as if measuring the invisible lines of danger below. Time seemed to pause, caught between motion and stillness, sound and memory. And beneath the frozen air, both sides waited for something larger than either. The shift that would decide who would remain. The snow continued to fall, covering both the living and the dead in the same pale peace. When winter finally settled, Zaitsev's story had already become part of the city's own legend to the men who fought beside him. He was a symbol of endurance, of quiet mastery in a world unraveling. To those who faced him, he was a phantom that turned every shadow into fear. But to the city itself, he was something simpler. One voice in its long, unending silence. His legend would outlast the battle, growing in retellings that blurred truth into poetry. Yet those who truly knew understood the essence of it: patience, precision, and the grace to move without being seen. The war would change, the front would shift, but the lesson of the snipers would remain, that stillness could sometimes be stronger than motion. In the end, there was no triumph, only continuation, the slow rhythm of endurance that defined them all. The river still flowed, indifferent, beneath the falling snow. And in the distance another day began, without light, carrying the echoes of all that still waited to unfold. They crossed not to survive, but to vanish, into the smoke that was now called Stalingrad. The Volga stretched wide and pale, a slow ribbon between the burning city and the open steppe. At its banks small ferries waited like patient boats at a pier, their timbers creaking softly with the pull of current. Men and women gathered in quiet lines, faces worn by movement and the weight of months. They passed bundles hand to hand, careful as if handling stories instead of supplies. Boats crossed by starlight and daylight, each trip a measured pulse against the river's steady breath. Sometimes artillery thundered from far away, and the ferrymen kept rowing as though following a ritual known only to them. Each crossing carried not only food and ammunition, but the fragile hope that the city might be held another day. The crews learned to move without excess noise, to fold into shadow and use the river's hush as cover. For all its size, the Volga offered only limited mercy, and every trip was a negotiation with chance. Yet they kept coming, time after time, believing the river could bear what their arms could not. And each morning the eastern shore received faces that had chosen to return to the smoke. Night crossings had a peculiar tenderness to them, a hush that felt almost sacred. Lanterns were shaded and voices were low, as the boats slipped through reflections of distant fires. Soldiers stood with rifles cradled, not as instruments of show, but as parts of the body that had learned to keep itself ready. The ferryman knew the river's moods, where the current whispered, and where it pulled like a thinking thing. They ferried whole units, small groups, the wounded, and the quiet parcels of mail that tied families together. Sometimes entire factories emptied onto the docks, the workers forming lines that moved with patient purpose. Mothers with scarves over their heads balanced baskets of bread and hot tea, offering hands to strangers who became companions for a crossing. There was no glory on those boats, only motion and the sound of paddles and the soft exhale of men holding breath. The river's surface reflected the city's distant flare-ups in trembling shards of light, and each time a boat landed, its passengers stepped onto a shore that felt both familiar and newly dangerous. They disembarked as if stepping into a different season of life, carrying quiet gifts and small griefs. Logistics became an art practiced with tired hands and clear minds on the Volga's banks. Commanders arranged schedules like prayers, sending waves of crossings timed to the rhythm of supply and need. Men loaded crates of ammunition with the same care as they wrapped bandages around fragile limbs. Engineers patched boats and fashioned improvised rafts from planks and barrels, calling each fix a small victory. The railway lines on the eastern bank hummed with trains that arrived and left in strict, weary cadence. Workers who had once built tractors now fixed engines and mended fabric, their hands remembering a different workaday life. Communication was a thread of whispers, runners, and coded notes tucked into pockets and rolls of tobacco. Fuel was the most precious currency, and its rationing required decisions that weighed entire units' fates. Sometimes the river offered a brief grace, a calm day, a fog that hid movement, a moon that kept watch. In those moments the crossings felt almost ceremonial, a ritual of persistence repeated until relief might arrive. And in that ritual, the river became both road and measure of how long the city could still breathe. The men who crossed learned to accept a certain kind of vanishing as part of their duty. They stepped from icy banks into the thin light of morning, each footfall absorbed by wet sand and mud. Conversations were short and practical, names, orders, the soft exchange of small comforts. A young soldier might press a photograph into another's palm and say nothing. A private prayer given over the river. Some carried tools, others carried newborn ration cards that promised bread and a future however small. Once on the far side, they melted into the city's ruined folds, becoming shadows among shadows. Even the most seasoned veterans learned to move as if they belonged to the river itself, letting its current teach rhythm. Their bravery was not in spectacle, but in the quiet repetition of stepping into unknown noise and returning when possible to row again. The crossings made a map of the small and essential, marking who had left and who had come back. They crossed not to survive, but to vanish, into the smoke that was now called Stalingrad. And in that vanishing, they found the strange economy of giving themselves to something larger than fear. Weather turned the crossings into acts of delicate balance as autumn pressed toward winter. Fog sometimes layered the water like wool, erasing the edges of the city until only sound guided the boatmen. Frost stiffened ropes and made hands ache, and men warmed them at the small flame of a shared stove. Ice formed along the shallows and forced boats to find new channels, maps rewritten by cold and shift. The river's current grew treacherous in parts, and captains learned where to avoid and where to trust the pull. Rain muddied the banks, turning the docks into soft fields that swallowed feet with each step. Yet even in worsening conditions, the duty continued, as if the weather were another partner in the labor. People adapted with quiet ingenuity. Tarps patched with oilcloth, fires lit in barrels to defrost hands. Children who had grown up near the Volga learned the crossings as part of their education, watching with wide, solemn eyes. The seasons taught the ferry crews resilience, a steady skill that would outlast any single storm. And as winter closed its fingers around the river, those skills became the thin line between holding and losing ground. Sometimes crossings were scenes of surprising tenderness amid the exhaustion. A wounded man might be carried in by two comrades, who hummed a song to steady both themselves and the injured. Nurses wrapped warm cloths around shivering shoulders and passed small cups of sweet tea to quiet panic. Men told jokes that were more rhythm than humor, their cadence keeping hands moving on ropes and oars. On certain nights, those who had made the trip paused together on the eastern bank to count stars and breathe as if they had returned from another world. The river gave them a kind of private communion, a space to be restored by the simple acts of washing and sharing bread. Some offered small prayers into the dark water, letting their words drift away on the current, as if to reach absent loved ones. Children watched with solemn attention, learning that courage could be a quiet thing done in pairs and small teams. These moments of softness knitted the crossings into a pattern of human connection that outlived fear's immediate pressure, and when they boarded again, the boatmen and passengers carried this warmth forward like a secret fuel. Those brief acts of tenderness became the hidden currency that paid for another day's crossing. The crossings were also a measure of sacrifice and calculation, a ledger kept in the heads of those who planned them. Commanders balanced the need to move men with the scarcity of boats and the constant threat of enemy fire. Sometimes choices were cruel simply because options were limited, and those choices hung in the air like smoke. Families waited on the far bank for news, eyes fixed on each arrival, as if it were a small miracle. When a ferry failed to return, the silence at the docks became a physical weight that pressed on everyone present. Yet more often than not, the boats came back, heavy with supplies and the quiet hum of survival. The river's pattern taught patience to those who had little of it left, asking them to trust in schedules and in the skill of hands. Each successful crossing meant another day the city might stand, another day for letters to be carried, another day for food to be distributed. They measured success in bread and in names that added up to units that could still hold a line, and in that arithmetic of endurance, the Volga itself became a ledger written in waves and returned oars. The decisions made at the docks were small, precise tragedies that kept the larger story breathing. In time, the crossing operations became an unspoken hymn to the city's stubbornness. The river's quiet work stitched east and west together in a braided line of lifeblood and memory. Men who had crossed many times began to recognize one another across crowds, nodding like old friends who shared a secret. Supply chains adapted and found ways to mitigate loss through redundancy and the careful rotation of crews. When relief or reinforcements arrived, they came by the same slow, careful method, each landing greeted with relief and hushed gratitude. The ferry crews were not heroes in any grand tale, but they were the steady hands that held the city together. Their names were often never recorded in official lists, but they lived in the memories of those who crossed and returned. Years later, some would recall the sound of paddles against wood and the river's patient murmur as if it were a lullaby. The crossings did not end the war, nor did they promise victory, but they prolonged the city's ability to resist. And as the Volga carried men and supplies under the soft light of morning and the hush of night, the river itself kept counting, one crossing at a time. And the river's steady counting would mark not only days, but the endurance that defined Stalingrad. The summer of 1942 had not been kind to Russia. Armies had retreated for months across endless plains, leaving behind burned villages and the echoes of old songs that no one dared to sing. Whole divisions had dissolved into the landscape, lost to exhaustion, hunger, and despair. At last, the government decided that retreat itself must end, even if the cost was unimaginable. On July 28th, Stalin issued an order that would change the soul of the war. Order No. 227, not one step back. It was not just a command, but a decree carved into the heart of every soldier who would now fight for Stalingrad. Those words moved through the ranks like a chill wind, quiet at first, then heavy and final. For some it brought clarity, a straight line drawn through chaos. For others it became a weight that pressed on every heartbeat, reminding them that fear now had no direction to run. From that moment on, retreat no longer existed, and the meaning of courage began to change shape. The order was read aloud in barracks, on riverbanks, in trenches half filled with mud. Men listened without expression, their faces grey with fatigue and dust. Some nodded as though it were expected, while others stared at the ground, silent and still. The words were simple, but their echo was immense. Those who retreated without command would face punishment, even death. Behind the front lines, special units, blocking detachments, were established to enforce discipline by force. The Red Army became a structure of steel within flesh, held upright by fear as much as duty. Yet fear, strange as it was, could also give form to determination. It hardened will where faith had faltered and turned hesitation into motion. Soldiers learned that survival was no longer a matter of luck, but of standing their ground until nothing else remained to stand upon. And through this shared burden they began to understand that the city behind them, Stalingrad, could not afford another inch of surrender. Discipline became both shield and chain. Commanders spoke less of victory and more of endurance, of the sacred duty to hold even when nothing seemed left to hold. Men dug trenches as though carving their own boundaries against despair. Each line in the earth became a promise, a fragile wall between them and the unthinkable. Some soldiers recited fragments of the order to themselves like a prayer, whispering its lines in the cold. Others hated it, muttering in secret that no law could fight on their behalf when courage ran dry. But even resentment gave shape to something steady, a reason to keep moving, a rhythm to march by. The presence of fear made every act of defiance heavier, more deliberate, more meaningful beneath it all. The human spirit adjusted, learning to walk in narrower spaces without falling apart. And within that narrowing, a kind of focus was born that would define the battle to come. The psychological weight of the order hung over Stalingrad, like smoke. Officers carried the knowledge that failure was no longer a temporary condition, but a permanent shame. Soldiers felt eyes on them from every direction, from comrades, from commanders, from the invisible machinery of the state itself. Yet in this claustrophobic atmosphere, something remarkable began to happen. Desperation transformed into unity. Each man, stripped of the option to flee, began to see the others not as separate lives, but as extensions of his own survival. When one fell, the rest closed the gap without thought, as if instinct had replaced command. Courage became communal, not individual, a shared necessity rather than a personal choice. In that strange alchemy, fear itself became a source of strength, and for the first time the Red Army began to match the German advance, not with numbers or weapons, but with something more enduring, the refusal to vanish. And that refusal would become the pulse that carried through every ruined street of the city. In the dugouts and ruined buildings, the order took on a life of its own. It was copied onto scraps of paper, carved into wooden beams, whispered during the long nights by the light of cigarette embers. Men who could not read still knew its meaning by heart. They spoke its finality in the rhythm of their work, in the way they loaded rifles or repaired a comrade's boots. It was not devotion to Stalin they followed, but the momentum of necessity that his words had set in motion. To stop now meant not just punishment, but the end of everything that defined them. Their fear was transformed into ritual, and ritual became identity. Even in exhaustion, they found a strange comfort in having no choice left to make. In that surrender of freedom, they discovered a kind of strength that even hope could not provide. And so, the order that had begun as terror became, in time, the quiet rhythm of endurance itself. Among the officers, the order forced difficult choices, to lead with compassion or to rule through obedience. Some found ways to inspire loyalty beyond fear, offering calm words and the assurance that endurance was a shared burden. Others followed the letter of the command without softness, measuring worth by obedience alone. Both kinds of leadership survived in the same narrow world, each sustained by the necessity of the other. In the chaos of the front, no one had the luxury of perfection. The system demanded results, and results meant holding ground, whatever the cost. Many who enforced the order paid for it in guilt that would never leave them. Yet without their severity, perhaps the line would have broken entirely, and history would have unfolded in another shape. Such contradictions were the essence of Stalingrad. Survival and sacrifice wound so tightly together that neither could be told apart. And through that paradox, the war's most brutal clarity took form. To the men on the front line, the order ceased to be politics and became something elemental. It was the cold air filling their lungs, the hard edge of a frozen rifle barrel against their skin, the knowledge that there was nowhere left to go. Even the sound of retreat, a single step backward, began to feel unnatural, like breaking the laws of gravity. When artillery roared behind them, it reminded them not only of defense, but of consequence. They learned to fight as though tethered to the ground itself, bound by an unseen cord that would never let them turn away. The fear that once paralyzed now propelled. Every brick, every ruined street corner, every burnt-out wall became sacred because it could not be abandoned. Each soldier became a fragment of the city's own defiance, indistinguishable from the dust and concrete that surrounded him. And in that merging, man and place became one, unyielding, immovable, inevitable. And in that unity, the myth of Stalingrad began to take its first breath. When word of the order reached the farthest corners of the front, it was met with the same silence that greeted all impossibilities. The world seemed smaller now, measured not in miles but in meters of defended ground. Yet within that confinement, meaning returned, raw, simple, undeniable. The soldiers no longer asked how long they could hold. They asked only how to endure the next hour, the next night, the next storm. The Volga, once a symbol of passage, became a wall, an edge beyond which there would be no return. Behind them lay the motherland, ahead the enemy, and between the two, a narrow strip of ruin that had to be held at any cost. It was the narrowest of worlds, but within it burned a clarity that history rarely grants. And as the wind moved across the river, and the city's fires dimmed to embers, the men of Stalingrad stood where they were, because they had no other place to stand. In the world of orders and oaths, retreat no longer existed, only silence or victory. Winter arrived slowly, at first like a thought, then as a reality that wrapped the world in white. The Volga, which had once carried boats and ferries, grew quiet under a skin of ice. Men on both banks watched as the surface hardened into a pale path that led nowhere but east and west. The air bit at faces and noses, turning breath to thin clouds that hung and dissolved. Clothing that had once seemed sufficient now felt thin and treacherous against the cold. Soldiers mended gloves by candlelight and tucked extra cloth into boots, as if stitching warmth into their steps. Even the dogs that had patrolled courtyards moved more slowly, their paws careful on frozen ground. The river's flat expanse changed the sound of the world, making each footstep a small declaration. Night came earlier, folding the land into long silhouettes and stretching shadows across fields of ice. And in that early winter hush, the city learned to listen to a new kind of silence. Frost collected, like patience along the edges of walls, and on broken rails, breath crystallized on eyelashes, and the sound of speech became softer, careful to not waste heat. Water buckets froze overnight, the skin of ice trembling with the memory of movement. The Volga's banks grew dangerous, thin with treacherous sheets that could not hold a heavy step. Engineers tested the ice with poles, listening to the dull music of hollow wood striking distant water. Ferrymen who had once known every current now consulted charts and instinct in equal measure. The crossings continued, but with a new ritual of caution and the slow pace of wrapped hands. Men traded simple comforts, a knitted cap, a small piece of bread, as if they were talismans. Sleep became more precious, and the city learned to ration warmth like a scarce resource. Outside, the frost kept tally in small silent numbers, marking the days with crystalline breath. Frost did more than chill bodies. It narrowed minds and widened the spaces between thought and action. Men began to dream strangely, seeing rivers climb hills and roofs that moved like waves. Some whispered of mirages formed by heat, long past, of familiar faces turning distant. Hallucinations settled into the corners of shelters like unwelcome guests, soft and persistent. Commanders noted an increase in accidents, not from enemy action, but from minds unmoored by cold. Letters arrived with ink smudged by frozen fingers, each line a small struggle against the weather. Still daily tasks continued. Boots were oiled, stoves were tended, kettles kept simmering. Men read by dim lamps, circling stories for comfort, and sometimes falling asleep over the page. In the quiet hours, some would step outside just to feel the sharpness of the air and remember being alive. The cold was a slow teacher, making small lessons of endurance out of each shivering night. Frost crept into wounds that had been only skin deep, making them ache in new ways. The idea of pain changed under the ice, becoming a measurement of how close one was to breaking. Medical stations worked in cramped rooms that smelled of oil and boiled wool, trying to hold bodies together. Nurses moved with soft efficiency, wrapping feet and hands, whispering names as if a voice could mend tissue. They told stories of summers so warm that the cold felt unnatural, and the stories themselves warmed whoever listened. Medicines were precious, doled out for fevers, and for the stubborn coughs that cut through the thin air. In basements, the smell of tea and boiled potatoes became a scent of continuity in a fragile world. Even small comforts like a heated stone pressed to a frozen ankle was celebrated with quiet gratitude. The human touch became currency, traded for confidence and the soft currency of hope. And while the frost lengthened the nights, the hands that tended kept vigil against the slow decline. The frozen Volga became both barrier and path, a silver line that separated need from supply. Convoys crept along roads made narrow by snowdrifts, engines coughing in the thin air. Drivers listened for the subtle differences in road surface, learning to read the snow by ear. Tracks were followed and re-followed, each one a lifeline marked by tire and tread. Supplies arrived less often, but with deliberate care, every crate an act of calculation. Men unloaded in the white light, their breath forming small clouds that dissolved into the day. The logistics officers moved like quiet conductors, assigning trucks and men with calm exactness. At night the snow muffled all sound, and the landscape became a place of patient, muffled motion. Sometimes the whole procession would halt for hours, waiting for the weather to grant passage. And though cold made everything slower, it also taught a kind of economy that preserved what little remained. Frost made small tasks into ceremonies of care. Unfreezing guns, oiling hinges, repairing boots. Men gathered around small stoves to warm hands and hands of comrades, sharing stories and rationed tea. The crackle of embers became a hymn to ordinary life, each pop a reminder of heat earned. In the evenings, voices grew softer, stories shorter, yet more meaningful for being concise. Children who remained in the city learned to make small games out of snow, shaping figures from what was available. Old women hummed as they mended garments, their needles moving like metronomes to steady the air. The city's rhythm slowed and found new grace in careful routines, measured by stoves and kettles. Even the sound of laughter found a place, a fragile bell that rang briefly before the cold returned. There was tenderness in these small repeated acts that kept community intact through the deep freeze. And in that tenderness the men and women of the city discovered ways to hold on until something could shift. But the cold also deepened the sense of solitude, making miles out of rooms and turning streets into deserts of white. Letters from home grew rarer and more precious, each one read aloud and savored slowly. Men pressed photographs to their chests, feeling warmth that came not from flesh but from memory. Conversations turned inward, memory dense, as if each person stored an entire life in a pocket of wool. Some began to speak less, letting the silence become a companion rather than an enemy. Others found ways to reach across the cold, a shared cigarette, an extra blanket, a small joke tucked into the dark. The river's frozen face reflected these private economies of care, its silence mirroring the hush between people. People learned to notice small signs of life, a boot print, a smoke plume, a light in a far window, and they read them like maps. The winter made every connection feel urgent and sacred, as if warmth could be passed hand to hand, like a relay baton. And so, in the long white days, community and loneliness braided themselves together into the city's new shape. As frost tightened its hold, the boundaries of the world seemed to shrink to the size of a room and a stove and a single shared bed. Men and women learned new vocabularies of care, words that spoke of small fixes and long waits. Hope did not vanish but became quieter, folded into routines and the small certainties of daily bread. In the coldest hours, some spoke of the river as a living thing, its ice like a skin they had to respect and not trust. They knew that sometimes the ice could crack, that the thaw could be sudden and treacherous, and this knowledge kept them humble. Yet beneath the fear there was also a slow confidence, a belief that such harsh seasons had been survived before and could be again. Men marked time by small rituals, the first crack of dawn on the frozen water, the smell of coffee, the sound of boots on packed snow. When the river finally taught them its limits, they would act with the same measured courage they had learned in the cold. For now, they listened to the ice's quiet lessons and let the frost teach patience in the place where movement had been their oldest skill. When the river froze, time itself seemed to stop, but death learned how to walk again. The winter had given the defenders a strange advantage, a rigid clarity to the land, and the maps that lay upon it. For months, Soviet planners had watched and waited, measuring supply lines, and listening to the rhythm of German movement. In dim offices and stove-warmed tents, generals drew new arcs on charts, with careful hands that had learned patience. They saw the thin seams where the enemy relied on Allied units of lesser strength, and marked those seams as places to press. The plan grew quietly in the minds of officers, a patient geometry of pincers that did not shout, but moved softly. Soldiers trained in secret, their steps practiced so that at the appointed moment the world would seem to tilt under their feet. The river froze in a brittle silence, and that silence became an ally to the planners who understood the meaning of stillness. Messages traveled wrapped in cloth, passed between units like fragile vows that could not be broken. When the date was set, it felt less like an order and more like the opening of a door that had been held closed for too long, and when the signal finally came, the quiet unspooled into motion. At dawn, the world seemed ordinary, thin ribbons of smoke, and the slow glide of frost across fields. Then artillery lifted like a low wind, not savage, but deliberate, arranging sound over distance. Troops moved in stages, not in frantic bursts, but in the steady cadence taught during months of preparation. Armor and infantry advanced along routes chosen to pinch the enemy's flanks, turning roads into folds of pressure. The air smelled of cold metal and hot oil, a scent that meant motion rather than celebration. German units, stretched and surprised, felt the ground change beneath their boots, as if the map itself had shifted. Messages arrived in hurried tones, commanders, realizing that the geometry they had trusted was closing in. Men on both sides listened for the rhythmic tramp that meant a new presence in their sector, the sound that would not stop. The river's frozen face glinted in the pale light, a silent witness to the slow tightening of lines. As the pincers moved inward, small acts of courage multiplied quietly, and the world narrowed to a ring that would not easily be left. At first, this belief spread not as panic but as a stunned hush, a sudden recalibration of maps and expectation. Units that had expected open ground found instead an invisible noose forming around them. Orders that had once seemed distant and theoretical became immediate, and men who had slept in the steppe awoke with new urgency. Radios crackled with terse reports, and commanders tried to reconcile their plans with the new geometry pressing from all sides. Some tried to break out, others dug in, and the snow received their choices without comment. The encircled forces turned inward, supply lines shortened into fragile threads that trembled under every gust of wind. The cold made movement costly and slow, and the weather wrote its own rules across the weary map. Within the ring, small communities of resistance formed, each pocket learning to share and to ration like old friends. Hope became a measure of distance and food, and the number of voices still heard in a trench at night. And as the circle completed itself, the hunters became the hunted, and the world tightened into a shape that matched the planner's quiet geometry. In the encircled Sixth Army, officers read the reports with a disbelieving calm, their faces drawn but composed. Field Marshal Paulus walked map tables with the slow gait of a man trying to find an error that could be corrected. Men argued over supply timetables and the feasibility of breakout attempts, as if arranging furniture in a room that would soon tilt. German radio traffic grew terse, then sporadic, and men who had known order found themselves learning to live with uncertainty. The bitter wind outside the tent walls made each decision heavier, insulating camps that had previously felt connected to supply from the rear. Soldiers clung to routines, polishing boots, checking straps, folding gloves, because ritual offered steadiness when plans unraveled. Small kindnesses became heroic, a shared piece of bread, the mending of a coat, a whispered joke passed between ranks. For some officers, the idea of surrender remained an abstraction that could not be entertained. For others, it crept closer like the cold. The human calculus of will versus survival played itself out in low voices and measured steps as the days narrowed. And as confusion pressed inward, the encircled army felt the soft inevitability of being held in a shape beyond immediate repair. On the Soviet side, The counteroffensive carried a hush of triumph, mixed with exhausted focus. Commanders watched the closing lines with faces that had learned to read patience as victory. Reinforcements continued to move along the river, each landing another stitch in the fabric that enwrapped the enemy. Engineers repaired roads and cleared canals with methodical hands that understood the arithmetic of supply. Medics and train crews worked through nights, carrying the wounded and folding new men into the pressing lines. There was little fanfare. Instead, celebrations were small and careful. A shared nod, a cigarette passed between comrades. The volunteers who had crossed the Volga took on new tasks. Learning that victory required both movement and maintenance, the planners breathed not with relief, but with the same steady inhalation that had paced them through months of waiting. For those who had held the line earlier, the encirclement felt like the fulfillment of a promise made in the cold and ash. And as the hunters became the hunted, the circle began to close quiet as a winter hand drawing shut a sleeve. The encirclement did not alter only the calculations of generals. It reshaped the daily world of civilians near and far. Families on the eastern bank watched with a mixture of hope and dread as reports of the ring reached their kitchens. Letters were read and reread. Neighbors gathered in whispers to share the smallest news that could be trusted. Churches and basements became places where people exchanged bread and solace, trading material for moral support. Children who had learned the rhythm of the docks now learned the rhythm of queues for heating coal and the slow patience of ration cards. Volunteers sewed bandages and knitted socks, small acts that felt like knitting the nation back together, one stitch at a time. The Volga itself seemed to bear witness, its frozen surface reflecting the hush of a people learning to hope in small measures. When news reached the city that the enemy was surrounded, the reaction was solemn rather than triumphant, as if joy knew the cost. Individuals felt the encirclement as a tightening of the world, smaller, more intimate, charged with the responsibility to endure, and through those tightened days, the city found new reserves of care and of quiet celebration for each small relief that arrived. The encirclement created supply problems that were immediate and unforgiving, reducing lifelines to fragile threads. The Luftwaffe promised resupply by air, and for a time, the sky became a lifeline of crates and fragile hope. Pilots flew into flurries of anti-aircraft fire, and the risk of frost that could chill engines and men alike. Many crates did reach the encircled units, but not in the numbers required to sustain an army indefinitely. Food became measure and rumor, counted in tins and portions, its scarcity turning meals into strategic calculations. Ammunition dwindled in certain sectors, and soldiers learned to conserve each bullet as if it were coin. Clothing and fuel were rationed with a precision that felt almost surgical in its necessity. The air deliveries, while noble in effort, could not replace the ease of road and rail, and the limits of those flights turned into a slow attrition. Sickness and exposure crept into the encircled formations, wearing at morale and bodies alike, and under that attrition, the geography of survival tightened further, a soft but unrelenting pressure on those within the ring. In the quiet that followed the initial shock, men learned new definitions of endurance shaped by cold and hunger. Conversations turned to memory and to the smallest comforts that remained, a warm scarf, a shared memory of summer. Officers wrote letters they would never send, folding sentiments into their map cases as if to keep them safe. Some found solace in routine, others in the companionship of those who stood beside them without speaking. The river, now a pale band of ice and water, seemed to hold its breath alongside the city, waiting for the next movement. Men who had once stalked across open plains now measured their world by the depth of snow and the sound of distant engines. The encirclement turned plans into prayers and plans into work, and the two became indistinguishable at times. There was a terrible clarity in the ring that allowed for no illusions. The future narrowed to the size of a defended courtyard. In letters and shouts in the hush of night watches, the human cost and human persistence were counted in small acts that together formed resistance. The hunters became the hunted, and the circle began to close. The pocket tightened like a hand closing slowly, and the city's edges began to fold inward until every street felt personal and small. Streets that once carried trams and markets now served as paths between shelter and supply, each step measured like a promise. Buildings leaned toward each other, their broken facades saving whispers and footsteps as if the walls themselves collected memory. Inside, people learned to move with an economy of motion that made even the smallest task an act of care. Food portions grew thinner, and the sharing of bread acquired a quiet ceremony, as if sustenance were a sacrament. Night watches multiplied, and sleep became precious, parceled out in shifts, so that someone always kept the light. Voices dropped, not from fear alone, but from a communal sense that sound wasted warmth and attention. Children learned to speak in fewer words, saving breath for the work at hand, and the consolations that mattered most. Laughter occurred like a brief, bright thing, then closed like a match put away for later, and so the city learned to hold its breath from one hour to the next. Rations were counted with slow, exact movements, and kitchens that had once been noisy now hummed with careful restraint. People traded stories of meals from before the war, as if retelling them might conjure warmth, and the memory of full tables became a currency of comfort. Medical posts filled with exhaustion, more than wounds, shelters filled with the slow wear of winter on fragile bodies. Doctors worked by lamplight, improvising with what they had, and offering steadiness where there could be no promises. Water froze in buckets overnight, and men learned to melt it slowly, conserving heat as if it were the most precious thing they owned. The counting of supplies became both ledger and ritual, a way to measure hope against need. Letters that arrived were read aloud in small groups, each sentence a tether to a life beyond the ring. In the basements and kitchens, the day-to-day acts of care stitched the community tighter, forming networks that carried more weight than any single order. Small comforts were tended like gardens in winter, cultivated with patient hands, and in kitchens and basements the day-to-day acts of care stitched the community tighter. Disorder here did not come as chaos, but as the arithmetic of scarcity that reshaped all plans into improvisation. Units lost cohesion as fuel and food thinned, and command charts blurred into decisions made with the map of necessity. Soldiers rearranged duties, trading work, so each person could rest, and another keep watch, learning new patterns of survival. Convoys that once moved without thought required negotiation and patience to schedule and protect. Every truck a small miracle. The fabric of daily life rewove itself around rituals of sharing and efficiency, the city's map redrawn in the lines of trust and favor. Old routines died quietly and new ones rose that matched the narrower world they now occupied. People began to know one another by what they carried: a spare blanket, a mender's skill, a remembered cookery. Neighborhoods functioned more by mutual aid than by orders from afar, and local leaders emerged whose authority came from kindness and competence rather than rank. The small economies of care became the true infrastructure of survival, and so the small economies of care became the true infrastructure of survival. Cold deepened every challenge, turning chores into negotiations with frost, and making small tasks large in consequence. Hands that had once loaded machines now unblocked frozen hinges and thawed engines with patient care. The scent of boiling water and warm bread took on a near-religious reverence among the weary, a comfort that felt almost holy, Basements were pressed into service as places of warmth and exchange, where people shared stories and small goods as if stitching one another back together. Neighbors who might never have spoken before now shared stoves and songs, inventing intimacy out of necessity. The rhythm of the day adjusted to the sun and the stove, and time felt coarser and more immediate because each moment demanded attention. Night patrols moved silently, steps muffled by snow and purpose, a cadence that steadied those who kept watch. The Volga's frozen face reflected routine rather than spectacle, a pale mirror of the city's inner work. Each dawn came with the hopeful smallness of another delivery or a single warm cup. And through this weathered choreography, life persisted in patient measures. Confusion crept into decision-making as information lagged and supply lines thinned to fragile threads that trembled under every gust of wind. Orders sometimes arrived late or not at all, and local commanders learned to improvise calmly, turning scarcity into planning. Councils of neighbors and officers gathered in courtyards to coordinate food, fuel, and watch schedules, speaking in short phrases and using lists on scrap paper. Trust became the most valuable currency in those meetings, exchanged in nods and in small acts returned later without expectation. Children helped by carrying water and tending fires, their labor a quiet apprenticeship in endurance and skill. The displacement of roles created new meanings for competence and courage among civilians who had never imagined being part of logistics work. Even the simplest plans required repeated confirmations, as if the world were now a delicate instrument to be tuned again and again. Occasionally a train arrived with relief, and the city breathed as one for a day or two, the pause of gratitude filling rooms. Those intermittent mercies reminded the people that their world, though small, had not been entirely cut off. These intermittent mercies reminded people that their world, though small, had not been entirely cut off. Stories and songs spread through the pocket, like threads that kept memory from unraveling and gave meaning to long cold hours. Old songs were hummed in cellars, poems recited to conjure summers and warmth for those who listened with shut eyes. The past became a refuge where sun could be imagined and comfort borrowed like a shared blanket, its image as real as any ration. Veterans told not of glory, but of practical lessons, which stairwell stayed warm, which cellar held echoes that warned of approaching steps. Those stories carried useful knowledge wrapped in the human voice, and nurses wrote down names and histories beside bunks to ensure no one was forgotten in the rush of need. Even rumors were used kindly, tested and shared, only when they offered direction or comfort, becoming a cautious chorus rather than wild gossip. The act of telling itself became an act of preservation and dignity, binding strangers into a small community of memory. In those narratives, people found continuity that war could not erase, a shared reservoir of identity. And so memory became a shared reservoir that kept the pocket from collapsing into silence. Morale changed its shape from public display to private endurance, a slow and tender reserve that moved through rooms like a warm current. Religious services were small and sincere, prayers offered for warmth, for bread, for the endurance to greet another morning. People found solace in rituals, the lighting of a candle, the folding of clean clothes, the careful mending of a precious scarf, gestures that mattered as much as any battle order. Volunteers organized makeshift performances where a single voice could transform a cellar into a place of reprieve, and the sound of music could repair a day. Laughter, when it came, was an admission of survival rather than denial, a brief, bright thing that spread gently through rooms. Acts of kindness multiplied in small, sustaining ways, an extra spoonful of stew, a coat lent for the night, a hand held through a fever. Compassion felt less like sentiment and more like strategy, a kind of communal armor that could not be exhausted. Leaders who showed empathy often held more sway than those who barked orders from behind maps. Each small act of care stitched people together into a fabric stronger than the sum of its parts, and in this slow weaving, hope found places to rest and gather strength for what might come next. The Kessel narrowed until movement itself became an argument of will against cold and hunger, and the city's soundscape reduced to the scrape of spoons and the murmur of councils. Soldiers who had once planned maneuvers now planned how to boil enough water for a squad, and maps were folded into lists of practical tasks. Discipline and improvisation balanced each other like hands on a rope, keeping units upright despite fatigue and the slow attrition of supplies. News from outside arrived in uneven breaths, sometimes promising relief and sometimes dissolving into silence that had to be endured. The Volga, distant and pale, held its steady current, as if to remind them the world beyond still moved and that their struggle remained part of a larger flow. Night watches took on a sacred quality, men finding purpose in keeping vigil for the sake of neighbors and memory, rather than glory. Some who had led before the encirclement learned from those who adapted faster to scarcity, humility becoming a form of leadership. Days felt both endless and unbearably short, each folded into the next like pages in a shrinking book. Small mercies, an unexpected parcel, a train that arrived, a returned face from a crossing were celebrated quietly, the city exhaling for a brief moment. Within the ring the city shrank to a whisper, and even whispers began to die. The hope of relief came from the sky, a promise spoken in confident tones far from the frozen lines. In Berlin, officers argued that planes could replace convoys, that wings might untie the knots that roads could not. Hermann Goering assured the High Command that the Luftwaffe could sustain the encircled forces by air, and his words reached the Sixth Army like a warm suggestion. For men who had watched trains become rumors, that promise felt like a rope thrown into a storm. Squadrons readied themselves, mechanics worked through nights, and air crews prepared a rhythm of takeoffs and landings that would become their new life. The eastern heavens filled with aircraft, small dark shapes, cutting through frost, and the pale light of morning toward the ring. Crates were loaded with tins and boots, and thin parcels of hope that would fall through cold air and try to land where roads no longer reached. Pilots flew low and careful, searching for strips of flat ground among rubble and ice, learning to see the ruined city as a patchwork of makeshift runways. Each successful delivery felt like a small miracle, worth a whispered prayer in a cellar or a dugout. And for a while, the sound of distant engines was a kind of music that measured days. The first flights felt like answers from above, and hope arranged itself around their rhythm. Soon the limits of promise became plain as frost on a window pane. Planes could carry only so much, and the arithmetic of need outran the capacity of wings. Weather turned many missions into experiments in patience, with fog and storms swallowing aircraft and turning runways into mirrors of danger. Anti-aircraft fire and the risk of landing on broken ground added a quiet terror to every descent and ascent. Crews dropped supplies on marked clearings and watched with held breath as parachutes opened like small, pale flowers, praying they would not snag on chimneys or trees. Some bundles landed exactly where intended and were pulled into waiting hands. Others tumbled into snowdrifts or broke on impact, their contents scattering like brief, useless confetti. Pilots who had been praised for daring found their triumphs measured by fractions, a crate here, a tin there, and the math of survival seemed unforgiving. Ground commanders counted calories and bullets as if both belonged to a single budget, and the mismatch between need and delivery became a constant ache. The airlift's shine dulled as officials studied manifest lists and realized how many more crates might have been required. The sky's small mercies were not enough to balance the long ledger of want. On the ground, the air deliveries became part ritual and part gamble. Men ran toward parachutes the way children run toward unexpected gifts, cautious and hopeful in the same breath. They learned to mark drop zones with sod and scrap as signaling beacons, to listen for the different pitches of approaching engines. When a plane came low and a crate descended true, the scramble that followed was fragile choreography: grab, unwrap, distribute, and return to cover. The goods were shared with an economy born of habit, the rations parceled with careful fingers and quiet counting. Sometimes the parachutes tanged in trees or on ruined roofs, and daring men climbed to fetch what gravity had left hanging. Other times the crates arrived where winter and war had conspired to make landing impossible, and disappointment slid through the crowd like chill wind. Nurses and medics prized the parcels that contained medicines most of all, murmuring thanks into the cold as they carried precious vials away. Children watched from cellars and doorways, learning the small arithmetic of hope measured in tins and blankets, and each successful drop, however small, stitched a thread of resilience into the city's frayed fabric. The Luftwaffe's promise was also a story told in leadership rooms and radio signals. Goering's assurances had a public brightness that became a private burden when the numbers were tallied. Pilots and mechanics felt both the pride of mission and the sting of being asked to do the impossible. Their logbooks filled with sorties that sometimes ended in engines frozen on return or planes buried by snowdrifts on remote fields. Aircrews mourned losses in a language that was both practical and sorrowful, noting men who never came back and machines that could not be repaired in time. Back in command tents, discussions turned to how far the air could stretch, which units might be prioritized, and which would receive less. The grinding math of war returned in the form of cargo weights, flight hours, and fuel allocations that never seemed generous enough. In quiet corridors, officers argued about whether the airlift was a noble rescue or a tragic illusion that postponed harder decisions. The weight of choice settled like frost on uniforms and maps, and so what had begun as promise increasingly read as an uneasy compromise between will and reality. There were days when the sky did give what was needed, and those days were remembered like holy interludes. A plane would appear in the low grey and deliver a crate that contained something immediate and vital: powdered milk for young ones, jam to sweeten the bitter bread, or bandages that would save a limb from worsening. For an hour or two, a neighborhood might breathe more easily, and voices would rise with the small gratitude of people who had learned the value of tiny mercies. Men and women carried the supplies to basements and shelters as if transporting sacred relics, arranging them in neat piles and sharing without fuss. Stories from those moments traveled quickly, and people in other pockets would watch the sky with renewed attention. Yet these uplifts were fleeting, and the memory of them cut deeper, a longing that could not be permanently sated. The contrast between bounty and want sharpened the sense that survival depended on rhythm and not miracles. Pilots who had brought those gifts down counted their flights with a tender sort of pride, aware that each success was also a reminder of how much remained necessary. Such bright hours warmed hearts, but they did not change the steady slide of scarcity. As winter deepened, the air bridge faced harsher truths that no political promise could erase. Engines protested in cold air, instruments iced, and runways became treacherous ribbons of packed snow and debris. Maintenance crews worked in the dark with hands thickened by cold, doing what they could to keep machines aloft. The rate of lost sorties increased, and every accident was a softening of confidence that spread like a slow dusk. Radio messages grew clipped and anxious, pilots speaking in short, practical phrases about fuel margins and visibility. Ground staff calculated which sectors would likely go without, and feelings of guilt and helplessness mixed with the resolve to try again. The boxes that once symbolized hope began to symbolize the limits of supply, and the men who packed them felt the weight of responsibility. Even as planes flew with skill and heart, the numbers simply did not add up to the need. The airlift shadow lengthened, showing how fragile was the plan that had promised to sustain an army, and slowly the polish of promise tarnished into the sober metal of reality. The human cost of relying on the sky became visible not only in crates and manifests, but in the faces of those waiting below. Soldiers in the pocket began to ration differently, saving certain items for those whose faces they recognized as needing them most. Commanders recalculated once again, trading hopes of relief for careful conservation and the grim planning of contingencies. Messages home grew fewer, and when they did arrive, they spoke softly of holding on by habits rather than by hope. Families and comrades developed an economy of patience that felt like a new form of courage, each small conservation a silent prayer. Pilots and crew who returned late at night walked through the city like men who had seen both mercy and loss in a single arc of flight. They shared quiet conversations about what might be done differently, but the answers were limited by weather, fuel, and the simple capacity of steel and canvas. The air bridge had become a lesson in humility for planners and a practice of sorrow for those it could not fully sustain. And as the days went on, the people below learned to read the sky as one reads a season, expectant but never certain. When talk of masses and miracles finally quieted into ordinary counting, the truth settled into a slow, reflective grief. The airlift had bought days and sometimes weeks, but it had not changed the geometry that held the Sixth Army in its tight ring. In high rooms and in low bunkers, men took stock and made the hard lists of what to conserve and what to share. Pilots put their hands on instruments with the same care as nurses, tending a fevered brow, and mechanics counted spare parts like benedictions. The rhythm of takeoffs and landings continued, not out of illusion but out of duty. Each sortie, another small insistence that they would not simply let the place be forgotten. Goering's assurances would remain part of the record, a promise made in the glare of command that could not fully meet the weather and the need. The sky had answered with courage and loss, and in its wake the people learned new measures of what it meant to be sustained. The sky itself grew tired of carrying the dead, and from that weary canopy a quieter reckoning began to take hold. The southeastern relief effort assembled with a hush that felt almost ceremonial, as if men were preparing for an intimate, difficult task rather than a public triumph. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein examined maps and reports with careful fingers, tracing routes that required both speed and caution. He gathered armored columns and infantry, balancing the thin arithmetic of fuel, men, and time against the fragile promise of reaching the ring. Staff officers worked by lamp and stove, folding messages into pockets and whispering schedules to couriers who would ride out at first light. The plan itself felt precise and patient, a geometry of pincers meant to open and ease the strain of the encircled army. Crews oiled treads and mechanics checked engines, each small action a careful offering to the larger task. The weather was already a participant in the plan, speaking in wind and snow that could make or break a day. Men packed what they could and left what they must, trusting that movement could transform into connection. For those who prepared, hope became a measured thing, counted in kilometers and hours rather than slogans. The attempt began with steady breath and patient feet. When the columns set out, the landscape received them like an old acquaintance, indifferent yet exacting in its demands. Snow filled empty fields and mutely erased the neat lines drawn on maps the night before. Drivers learned to read the road by sound, feeling the subtle differences beneath the wheels as if listening to a language. Reconnaissance moved ahead in quiet, sending back small reports about tracks and hidden pitfalls. Troops kept their pace slow and steady, mindful that haste in such weather could be the kind that ends plans rather than fulfills them. At nights along the route, men huddled by modest fires, sharing bread and hushed conversation, while engines cooled and stars watched cold and distant. Engineers cleared the occasional drift, jacked up a frozen axle, and did simple, essential work that held the columns together. Radios crackled with updates. Each message was received like a thin strand of promise. The simple motion of progress brought its own weary relief. Possibility bent the sky like a hand cupping a flame. Inside the pocket, the rumor of relief moved like light through basements and courtyards, bringing a fragile warmth to faces steeped in frost. People paused in their small tasks to listen for distant engines and to hope that the sound would be more than wind. Word that a push was underway traveled from ear to ear, gathering concentration and a muted, guarded joy. Men tidied the few possessions they dared to keep, mended belts, and checked straps, as if readiness could be shaped by ritual. Nurses and medics moved into efficient motion, preparing for wounded arrivals or for the difficult decisions that help might force. The presence of approaching columns sharpened both courage and anxiety in equal measure, a mixture that steadied hands and shortened nights. Children learned to watch the horizon in a new way, naming each distant shape that might be a vehicle or only a cloud. Conversations became practical and precise, gratitude mixed with caution in the way people spoke and smiled. The city's heartbeat quickened in a small, disciplined way, and for a few fragile hours, every ear listened for the soft thud of tracks in the snow. As the relief formations neared, they found the landscape answering them with a stubborn resistance that was neither cruel nor personal. Drifts filled gullies and turned roads into uncertain puzzles that demanded constant attention. Reconnaissance reported gaps to exploit and villages to pass, and every small victory of route finding felt rare and earned. Local farmers pointed out tracks and remembered which bridges had borne weight in milder seasons. Their knowledge folded into the column's slow advance. At times the troops found small clusters of shelter where strangers shared tea and offered the scarce warmth of human kindness. Engineers worked with patient hands to mend bridges, clear culverts, and scrape ice from moving parts. Radios held a low, steady traffic of updates, each one a careful accounting of distance and condition. Men moved as if performing a prolonged, exact choreography, each step practiced and deliberate. The columns inched forward through white fields like slow metronomes, keeping time against the cold. And with each careful mile, salvation drew nearer in the mind, if not yet in the flesh. Nearer still, the weather conspired in ways that turned possibility into its own hardship, making timing the cruelest of factors. Snowstorms could arrive without much warning and erase the tracks that had taken hours to forge, leaving vehicles to flounder and men to find new paths. Visibility shrank so that familiar landmarks became unreliable, and pilots returning from reconnaissance reported clouds that hid more than they revealed. The sound of movement blurred into the hush of weather, and each hour lost felt like a small theft of a fragile chance. Men felt fatigue in their lips and fingers, as hope and weariness weighed in equal measure. Messages promising a final push sat in command tense, waiting for a clear window that sometimes did not arrive. Those who had hoped for a decisive immediate joining began to learn the bitter arithmetic of weather and time. The nearer the columns came, the more the landscape tested their patience and resolve. Yet the mind that moved forward still carried a slender optimism, like a fragile ember. And in that reach, many found their hands chilled and slow. The pursuit of connection took on an urgency that was not loud but dense with feeling, as though every missed hour layered another small sorrow onto the map. Armored units pushed through drifts with careful brakes and lower speeds, their treads chewing the white into temporary roads. Infantry advanced in step beside them, each man a quiet pledge to the effort at large. For a time it seemed the edges might meet, and a spare light rose in basements and dugouts, where people dared to imagine movement toward safety. Convoys strained with supply, and medics kept their lists and stretchers close at hand, hoping for a chance to move those most fragile. Commanders exchanged signals that were thin with hope and thick with the cold calculus of what could be risked. Pilots made test runs, eyes straining against clouds, and men on the ground listened for the engines that might carry help. The closeness bred a new tension, for proximity without contact sharpened longing rather than easing it. Salvation hovered like breath on a cold mirror, visible but slipping away. Decisions piled on decisions as hours turned into an own kind of pressure, testing both human endurance and command clarity. Some voices urged a final daring push that might pierce a narrow seam and offer a corridor of relief. Others advised caution, noting the danger of committing the last reserves and giving ground elsewhere. The radios hummed with contradictory tones, and the men took orders that bent under the weight of weather and fatigue. In the snow, plans required more than will. They needed the precise alignment of timing, ground, and chance. When the hours that mattered failed to align, opportunity softened into regret, carrying with it the long private sorrow of what almost was. Soldiers learned to carry the new language of almost, a word that tasted of what could have been and could not now be changed. The relief columns became silhouettes that moved without landing, as if the map itself refused to be completed. And as command wheels slowed, hope thinned like smoke at dawn. When the final assessments were made, and the push could not be extended into the decisive link many had prayed for, the emotional cost settled like a hush across both the relief forces and those awaiting rescue. Men who had moved with disciplined hope returned to their quarters with faces that read of fatigue and private regret. Commanders counted what they had risked and what remained, folding complex decisions into careful notes they would reread for months. Inside the pocket, defenders felt a small, hard absence where expectation had once been, and learned the slow art of returning to the work of endurance. The locals resumed their quiet tasks, knitting and repairing and rationing, as if repeating them might help time. Forget the near miss. Pilots, mechanics, and drivers cleaned and checked their machines again, each action a humble act of perseverance, rather than a grand promise. Conversations about what might have been moved into the realm of memory and quiet counsel, rather than sharp argument. Years later, survivors would tell of how near the world had seemed to tilt, and how that tilt did not become return. Through the snow, salvation flickered, then froze forever. The orders reached him in papers that smelled faintly of tobacco and ink, folded into the map cases that lay on the table like relics. Friedrich Paulus moved among them with a careful hand, touching corners as if feeling the outlines of decisions rather than the paper itself. He had once been certain in the language of maneuvers, a man who read roots and numbers with steady eyes. Now the inked lines seemed to tremble, as if the map itself were uneasy about the ground it described. Men around him spoke in measured tones, their voices lowered by the weight of what those lines implied. Outside, the wind moved over snow in long, indifferent sweeps, carrying the sound of engines like a distant cough. Officers debated options in hushed phrases, trading probabilities as if they were coins to be spent. Paulus listened and folded his hands, learning to measure silence as another form of counsel. He was both leader and listener now, learning the peculiar loneliness of command, when certainty has been eroded by weather and want, and in those quiet moments the lines on the maps began to feel like instructions written for ghosts. Inside the headquarters tent, light came through canvas and frost, painting the maps in muted tones that matched the men's faces. The list of needs, fuel, ammunition, food, was a ledger that grew skinnier each day and made the simplest choices feel enormous. Messengers arrived with reports that were part fact, part hope, and part pleading. Their breath fogged in the cold air as they spoke. Paulus read and reread each note, testing the edges of possibility like one tests a seam for cold. He consulted his staff in soft, circular conversations, trying to shape a path that might undo the ring, or at least make survival more reasonable. The weight of higher command pressed like a winter blanket, heavy and close, limiting movement and the luxury of doubt. He felt the invisible hand of politics, as surely as he felt the bite of frost. Orders that were not merely military, but symbolic. The harder choices lay not only in how to move men and material, but in how to answer the larger question of honor and survival. Those around him watched for any sign, a hard jaw, a sudden decision, as if leadership were something visible in posture rather than in thought. And when he looked out across the snow, the horizon seemed to demand a kind of impossible steadiness. Around the ring, soldiers measured the future by small things. The number of rations left in a crate, the thickness of a coat, the sound of a distant engine. Men who had once spoken of strategy now spoke in the language of the immediate, naming what could be mended and what must be spared. Paulus received these reports with a quiet gravity, aware that every refusal or assent would ripple through lives in ways no order could fully predict. He convened councils not to show he controlled fate, but to build fragile consensus in a place where nothing felt certain. In private, he walked the narrow path between duty and dread, feeling both the institutional weight of his uniform and the human weight of those who looked to him for an answer. He thought of his men not as numbers, but as faces that had names, and that personal ledger made policies heavier. Outside the tent, snow fell and erased tracks, as if the world were trying to forget the paths that had been taken. Hope in the pocket became a measured routine, not a feverish expectation, shaped by the slow arithmetic of supply and weather. In that measured space, every decision took on an almost ceremonial stillness, and with each choice, the gap between command and consequence felt more intimate and raw. Orders from above sometimes arrived with the brittle brightness of certainty, words that left little room for doubt or human cost. Hitler's voice, conveyed through channels and emissaries, carried the authority of politics folded into military demand. Paulus wrestled with that authority as a man might wrestle with a cold fact that will not warm, comparing official will to the reality underfoot. He weighed the dignity of obedience against the duty to his men, feeling the tug of both like two tides pulling at a single shoreline. Subordinates watched him, learning from his hesitation and his resolve, understanding that in such times leadership is often a mosaic of small mercies and hard refusals. Even if he was bound by oath, the humanity in him refused to remain silent, when questions of life and death were at stake. He spoke softly with officers who faced self-same dilemmas, and in those conversations the language of strategy became a human conversation about preservation. Each night he folded the maps and put them away, knowing the world they described could change overnight. The paper traces remained, but the men behind the numbers were no longer abstractions to be ordered. And so orders that came from a distant seat of power entered a human field and met the weather of doubt and care. As supplies thinned and temperatures bit deeper, the lines of rank blurred into lines of shared fatigue. Paulus walked among troops sometimes without fanfare, his presence a small, steady thing, amid the larger ache of cold and hunger. Soldiers looked at him and searched for a signal that might ease their minds, some gesture that said they would be led back to safety, or at least not abandoned. He offered what comfort he could, a kind word, a nod, an acknowledgement that their endurance had been seen. Those gestures mattered in ways that orders did not. They became a currency of trust that sometimes did more to steady men than any document could. Yet beneath these small acts was the persistent reality that the ring tightened and air deliveries were insufficient for the need. The mental burden of knowing people's lives were counting on his decisions weighed on him like frost on canvas. He found himself awake long into the night, listening to the world breathe, and trying to find a plan that honored both duty and preservation. The intersection of personal care and command became his daily pilgrimage, and in that work he kept learning that leadership in such a place is less about decree than about keeping people human. Conversations about surrender grew in hushed tones as the realities of the Kessel took on more palpable shape. Some officers argued pragmatically that laying down arms might spare lives and conserve dignity in the face of certain ruin. Others replied with the ethos of duty and the fear of what surrender might mean for them and their families back home. Paulus heard both sides as if attending to two languages of the same grief. He did not trivialize either argument, and his reluctance to speak plainly about surrender came from the weight of consequences that stretched beyond the immediate. He knew that surrender was not simply an act of ceasing fire, it was a decision tangled with politics, propaganda, and very personal fear of reprisal. Nightly councils became exercises in moral arithmetic, adding and subtracting possibilities until the sums offered no comfort. The men around him watched for the moment he would give a clear direction, measuring their own courage against the line he would draw. And though outwardly composed, he felt the inner cracks widen as he navigated between orders and the faces of those he commanded. Thus the question of surrender moved from theoretical discussion into the quiet center of human endurance. Outside pressure from higher command kept hope alive in paper and rhetoric. Even as reality hardened, promises were made, signals sent, plans articulated, yet the mechanics of war, fuel, cold, and logistics, had their own blunt logic. Paulus received dispatches that felt like warm promises mailed from a place that could not see the teeth of the weather or the thinness of the crates. Each line from above required translation into acts that the men on the ground could live by, a task that became increasingly impossible. He found himself making smaller and smaller decisions that nonetheless bore the weight of life. Sometimes the choice was simply which wounded to move and which to tend where they lay, and the moral calculus of that choice chewed at him. He tried to answer with a quiet resolve, focusing on what could be managed, but the gap between hope and supply kept widening. Every time a plane failed to land, or a convoy stalled, the distance between rhetoric and reality grew more apparent. The orders outlived the men in that they could be given again and again, while the men themselves grew thinner, and in that mismatch, command began to feel like a set of ghosts that could not shepherd the living. In the end, Paulus made the decisions he could, with the care he could summon, balancing honor and survival as best he understood them. He kept his men informed with the honesty he thought they deserved, and tried to preserve as much dignity as circumstances allowed. The cold and the silence taught him and his officers to honor small acts. A stew shared, a boot repaired, a name remembered, as the currencies of perseverance. He wrote notes and kept records, not merely of movements, but of faces and small favors, as if to prevent people from disappearing into statistics. When surrender was finally discussed in terms that could not be evaded, he felt the terrible weight of history settle like a quiet cloak around his shoulders. The decisions he made then were less about glory and more about the sober accounting of lives left to be spared. Later historians and storytellers would argue about whether alternatives existed, but at that time his world was measured in breaths and ration tins rather than grand strategy. He did what he could in the narrowness he inhabited. A man attempting to marry duty with the hush of mercy. When orders outlive men, they become ghosts that command nothing but ruin. The city's medical places had become a different kind of map, lines of light in underground rooms and shelters. Nurses moved with the slow precision of people who have learned to value gesture over words. Patients lay on cots arranged in rows, each one a small island in a dim sea of wool and lamp glow. Doctors spoke softly, their voices like measured instruments cutting through tired air. The smell of boiled potatoes, antiseptic, and old cloth settled into the corners like a familiar song. Volunteers carried trays and blankets as if carrying notes of a long tender hymn. Conversations were short, filled with names and small requests, rather than grand statements of hope. In these rooms, people counted time by breaths and by the slow ticking of a watch hung on a hook. The world outside remained a hush of ice and distant engines, but here life was immediate and intimate. And so the hospitals and cellars gathered what life remained, holding it gently as if to protect a fragile ember. Basements became theaters of endurance, where light was measured in candle flames and lamp oil. People found ways to make rooms into islands of care, setting up simple bunks and making curtains from blankets. A child might sleep beside a wounded man, their breaths pacing like a small duet in the dark, the soft scrape of spoon on tin, and the low murmur of shared stories were the soundscape of these places. Nurses folded bandages with hands grown deft from repetition, their movements as calm as prayer. Each small act of tending became its own kind of ritual that steadied both giver and receiver. There were wooden signs marking rooms and names, a human attempt to keep order in a world fraying at the edges. Sometimes the staff would hum old songs under their breath to pull courage into the room like warm cloth. Visitors left small tokens, a knitted mitten, a scrap of fabric, objects that conveyed more than words could. In the hush of these basements, life and memory braided together into a single resilient thread. Field hospitals operated at the limit of equipment and hope, improvising tools and comforts from what was at hand. Syringes were sterilized over small flames, and splints fashioned from scrap wood and warm bandages. Medics moved with a compassion that softened the austerity of clinical work into human kindness. They kept lists of names and stories so that each person remained more than a number in the ledger of war. The sound of a single footstep in a corridor could draw 100 eyes, a reminder that companionship mattered. Patients spoke of small things from home, the smell of rye bread, the clack of a neighbor's kettle, and such memories became medicine. Children were soothed with the same simple rituals that had comforted generations, a lullaby, a cup of warm milk, a careful touch. In these wards, the spiritual and the practical met, and both were tended with equal attention. Often a wounded man would wake and find a stranger holding his hand, as if that hand were the most natural place to belong. The field hospitals labored quietly, stitching broken days into a softer continuity. Bunkers and makeshift shelters often hosted the hardest conversations, held close and low so as not to waste heat in speech. Men spoke of futures as if they were delicate plans to be filed and preserved for better weather. Officers and civilians alike swapped practical counsel about preserving warmth and conserving food, with an economy that felt almost sacred. Sometimes they read letters aloud, each line a lifeline back to people who lived beyond the immediate white hush. Nurses crossed between these pockets of conversation, carrying tea and the small balm of presence. Laughter occurred in these places like a rare blossom in snow, brief and cherished, and then discreetly folded away. The bunkers themselves had a smell, damp wood, tobacco, and an old wool that clung to the air. People built their routines around the stove cycles, a steady, warming rhythm offering structure to the day. In those rooms, in the softness of low light, decisions about care and kindness were made with gentle gravity, and so the bunkers became places where life continued in small, dignified increments. The caretakers were many doctors, nurses, volunteers, factory women, repurposed as aides, and the occasional gentle soldier who offered a steady hand. They all shared simple tools and an enormous patience, learning new skills by necessity and by will. Training was informal, a whispered lesson beside a bed, a correction of posture, the showing of how to warm a frozen foot. These teachers exchanged wisdom the way others exchanged bread, with humility and without claim. In the evenings they compared notes and sometimes traded jokes that sounded like small secrets against the intensity of day. Their eyes reflected the work's weight, but also a quiet contentment. When a patient took a breath and held it steady, they took care to speak kindly to the weary, knowing that a tone could be as restorative as any medicine. Where medicines ran short, they used the gentlest forms of comfort, a warm compress, a folded blanket, a patient ear. The school of care that grew in those rooms was practical and sacred at once, taught by the daily need to keep one another alive. And in their patient labor, the caretakers created a network of resilience that sustained the city's fragile spirit. The boundary between life and death blurred in spaces where time itself seemed to slow and thicken. Sometimes a patient lingered, holding to breath like a prayer, a small insistence against the world's pressure. Family members sat at bedside for hours, their hands folded over one another, trading warmth and quiet stories. In that hush, the meaning of presence revealed itself, to be there, to hold, to remember. The act of attending became an art of endurance, requiring small rituals repeated until they smoothed the edges of fear. People who had once been strangers learned to read each other's pauses and to translate the smallest gestures into comfort. The city's clinics thus became a library of human stories, each bed a book of memory and quiet courage. Nurses kept tallies of births and of those who passed as if to honor the measure of life in simple numbers. Those tallies were read aloud sometimes, not as grim accounting, but as the continuity of belonging. In these rooms, where breath and memory convened, the city practiced the slow work of remembering itself. The last and softest medicines were not pills but presence, the warmth of a hand, the steadying of an anxious voice. Volunteers read letters and recited poems, bringing distant voices close into the room's circle. Children drew simple pictures and pinned them above cots like talismans, small drawings that reminded everyone of home. Songs that had been hummed by grandmothers in peacetime echoed through cellars and became a quiet soundtrack to healing. Priests and laypeople offered small prayers that were more about company than doctrine, a communal breath against solitude. The exchange of stories, the way one person's memory could rekindle another's courage, became the most effective remedy. Even where medicine could not reach, these acts pulled the edges of the day back into a human shape. When a patient's breath finally eased, people closed eyes and whispered thanks as if to close a book tenderly. Those moments of farewell were private, soft, and handled with the utmost dignity, shielded from sensational telling. And as they tended the living and honored the passing, the caretakers helped weave the city's memory into a fabric that would endure. In time, the houses of the dying became places of quiet testimony, repositories of the small graces that had kept people steady. Visitors who returned later would find notes tucked away and objects placed with deliberate care, signs that lives had been lived in 1,000 quiet ways. The city's memory was shaped here more than in any map or proclamation, formed by acts of attention and by the ritual of tending. These rooms held both the sorrow and the stubborn joy that comes from shared endurance, a paradox that made life possible. People who had known the hush of these wards carried its lessons outward, teaching neighbors how to sew, how to brew, how to mend everything small and essential. The experience changed those who had been caretakers into keepers of continuity, people who would later tell stories that taught future days about gentleness under pressure. Across years, those quiet memories would persist in the city's spoken histories, soft testimonies that resisted loud myths. Walking streets after the war, some would still pause at cellars and doorways, feeling the echo of a hand offered in a time of need. Stalingrad's endurance was not only measured by battles, but by the way it had tended itself in the hours when outcomes were uncertain. The city no longer fought, it remembered. The final days in the pocket had a quality of hollowing out, as if the world had been slowly scooped of its ordinary colors. Men and women moved through a landscape that had been pared down to essentials: warmth, food, a place to rest. The rhythm of life became a sequence of small, careful acts, repeated until they felt like prayers. Kitchens boiled what little could be spared and shared with neighbors who became family by necessity. Messages arrived in thin threads and were read aloud in basements to keep everyone aligned with what little news there was. On the river, ice glinted a pale, patient silver, untroubled by the urgent human affairs nearby. The sky was a cold, pale bowl over everything, and even the birds flew lower, moving as if respecting the hush below. Soldiers walked with deliberate slowness, their faces mapped by frost and concentration. A kind of exhausted grace took hold, making rooms into chapels of endurance and quiet. In that softened world, the sound of the last gunshots began to feel like a distant bell that had already done its work and was now finishing its toll. Supply had long been uncertain, and the small mercies of an occasional delivery felt both immense and insufficient. Food was portioned with solemn care, and the counting of bread became a communal ritual that no one took lightly. Medical staff worked in shifts that blurred into one another, their hands steady though their eyes were tired. Men traded practical kindnesses, offering blankets and boots to those whose need tipped them past endurance. Letters from home were read until their ink seemed to warm the cold room, each line a fragile bridge to another life. Conversations became short and precise, focused on the next hour rather than distant hopes. In quiet courtyards, Neighbors shared memories of past summers and allowed themselves brief, careful smiles. The mind learned to celebrate small survival as if it were a medal of a different kind. News of negotiations and hopes for relief circulated like weather reports, always changeable and seldom entirely accurate. Each morning that people rose felt like a small triumph held together by habits rather than certainty. Command and morale were strained in ways that felt personal and institutional at once. Officers tried to balance orders from distant leaders with the blunt human facts on the ground. Some men felt the weight of authority as an added burden, while others drew strength from clear, if grim, direction. Field headquarters became places of quiet calculation, where maps and faces were given equal attention. Councils were held with low voices, and decisions were made in the soft light of lamps that hummed with heat. Men discussed options with a weary rationality, trading immediate comforts for the slimmest chance of a future. The idea of surrender hovered in private conversations like an unwelcome shadow that would not be named aloud. Yet, as options dwindled, the language of choice narrowed to preserve what could still be saved. Through the tension, people displayed small acts of leadership that were more about kindness than rank. Those acts kept routine together, and routine kept people human until the path forward could be agreed upon. The day when formal surrender discussions began felt strangely ordinary at first, as if the city had finally accepted the need to speak plainly. Delegations were gathered and shuttled with quiet care, their faces pale and steady under knitted caps and scarves. There was a practical choreography to the negotiations, steps taken to preserve dignity even in compromise. Representatives spoke not in the extreme rhetoric of propaganda, but in the measured language of barter and safety. They discussed the treatment of prisoners, the care of the wounded, and the simple logistics of movement from one shore to another. Each proposal carried the weight of lives and futures, and every concession was debated with gravity. Soldiers listened and folded their hands, waiting for what agreements might bring, and for what fears they might not relieve. At the same time, civilians quietly prepared for the aftermath, mending clothes and packing small belongings with tender focus. Nurses and clerks kept lists of names, the human inventory that would ensure faces were not erased in the process. Through these practical steps, the slow business of ending a siege took on the tone of careful common sense. When the formal decision to cease resistance was announced, the city seemed to inhale and then exhale in a single, long movement. Men lowered weapons with hands that trembled, not from weakness but from the sudden unmooring of a purpose that had been their lodestar. Some wept softly, and then wiped their faces with the same unceremonious motion used to mend clothing. Others sat in silence, letting the change ripple through them as if they were leaves settling on a river. The act of surrender was not theatrical. It was a slow, dignified rearrangement of life into new categories. Officers took responsibility for orderly withdrawal and for the preservation of the wounded as best they could. Civilians offered bread and tea to those who stood down, gestures of quiet humanity that carried more meaning than orders. There was time in those hours for small reconciliations and for visits between neighbors who had kept one another alive. Prayers were said in corners and basements, not in grand collective fashion, but in intimate murmurs that honored the hard decision. And as people began to move with the new arrangements, the hush of surrender settled like a soft, dense snow over everything that had been. The actual process of moving across lines took on the rhythm of ritual and care, each step choreographed to avoid panic. Soldiers gathered their few belongings, folding shirts and smoothing scarves as if preparing for a modest pilgrimage. Medics arranged stretchers and gathered records, making sure names matched faces and that stories would not be lost. Parents clasped children's hands, leading them toward marked paths and sheltering their smallness with tender protectiveness. Some who had been wounded were carried with a gentleness that felt fuller than any command could require. The transfer points were calm in their own way, with officers and volunteers coordinating quietly under the pale sky. Exchanges of food and water took place in measured portions, each small offering a handshake of human decency. The riverbanks, once routes of reinforcements, became thoroughfares of departure, lined with people bearing the soft gravity of farewell. Those who crossed did so with a blend of relief and sorrow, knowing that movement meant both escape and an ending. In that careful passage, the city learned a final lesson in how to leave with dignity. After the surrender, the immediate silence that followed combat felt like a heavy blanket laid gently over the city. Some areas received care from those who remained to organize aid and instruction, giving out blankets and tea with quiet efficiency. Others were left to sadden and settle, where time itself seemed to slow, and the tasks of rebuilding waited softly. Men and women traded stories in low tones about what had been learned and what must never be forgotten. The wounded were tended with a patience that honored the vulnerability of bodies and the fragility of morale. Prisoners and civilians alike found places where simple procedures established order and safety, and these routines helped ease fear. Across the river and beyond, families awaited news, and the slow reunions that would follow, many prepared for imperfect outcomes. In cellars and shelters, people sang quietly or read aloud, practices that reknit social life with small threads of common culture. The city's rhythm shifted from urgency to the sober work of care and accounting, tasks that would shape recovery. And amid the stillness that grew, new ways of remembering began to form as gentle practices rather than loud proclamations. Time after surrender folded into small routines of registration and the careful distribution of blankets and boiled tea. Officers from both sides negotiated the care of the wounded and the movement of civilians with an emphasis on safety and dignity. Volunteers recorded names and places and attempted to preserve the threads of community that the siege had woven. Quiet processions carried the injured to larger tents and to trains that would carry some away toward hospitals and farther horizons. Conversations turned to the future in a subdued way, mapping what rebuilding might require and how neighborhoods could begin to repair themselves. Children listened to elders recount small practical stories about mending and growing things to eat, stories that contained both instruction and hope. People planted seeds of trust alongside literal seedlings, beginning to imagine gardens where rubble had lain. The river continued its slow work of carrying light and memory downstream, indifferent and consoling in equal measure. In the months that followed, the city would keep learning how to braid sorrow into ordinary daily life, honoring without being trapped by the past. When the last shot faded, the wind began to speak in their place. The city lay quiet in the thin light after the guns had gone, its skeleton of chimneys and twisted metal casting long, patient shadows. People walked slowly through streets that had once been straight and known, their footsteps careful, as if afraid of waking some lingering memory. Rubble made new paths and courtyards, turning familiar routes into gentle puzzles that asked for attention. Survivors bent to pick up objects small and ordinary, objects that carried entire lives in their weight and smell. A cup, a child's toy. A photograph became talismans both fragile and fierce. Each item a story folded into the palm. Voices were low and measured, sharing names and stories in the slow cadence of people who had waited too long. The river beyond remained steady, its current carrying light and rumor alike, with a soft, indifferent patience. Aid workers and neighbors moved in the same deliberate rhythm, sorting needs and offering small comforts with practiced kindness. In those first days after the fighting, gestures of care knitted fragile trust back across courtyards and cellars. Among the stones, memory began to rebuild what life could not. Aid arrived in stages, not all at once, and each crate was handled with tender efficiency by hands that had learned to move with purpose. Tents rose in courtyards and fields, simple shelters that smelled of canvas, wood smoke, and soap, and these became places for lists and names and warm kettles. Nurses set up orderly rows and careful registries, anchoring faces to the names that would not be lost in time. Families reunited in quiet clusters, embracing, as if to test whether touch could remake the texture of ordinary life. Some found that small routines could heal as surely as any medicine. A warm kettle, a mended sock, the slow ritual of boiling soup and sharing the steam. Children relearned games in softened alleys, their laughter thin at first and then more confident. As days lengthened, elders told stories of seasons before the war, and these tales knitted the present into a continuity that soothed tired minds. Journalists and officials came to record and to plan, their papers filled with maps and lists, and the careful language of rebuilding. In the quiet labor of aid and simple domestic recovery, the city began the slow work of being itself again. Photographs were taken and testimonies collected in rooms that smelled of ink and boiled tea. Voices recorded with patient microphones and steady hands. Survivors recounted days measured by the taste of bread and the length of night, their words soft but precise as they offered detail for those who would listen. Some accounts held silence as a meaningful answer. Others focused on small acts of kindness that had kept people afloat. A shared blanket, a handed cup, a whispered name. Historians later pieced these memories together, balancing personal recollection with orders, maps, and dispatches to form a fuller picture. The narratives grew into many shapes: heroic, tragic, ordinary. Each thread needed to make the whole cloth of understanding. In halls and newly repaired theaters, people gathered to listen, to testify, and to remember with a discipline born of necessity rather than spectacle. The act of telling became a civic ritual, a way to place loss within a human story rather than an abstract ledger. Memory work moved slowly, respectful of those who needed time before speaking, and kind to those whose words were raw and unfinished. Through testimony and careful listening, the city's past took shape in voices that were particular and also quietly universal. Architects and planners studied the ruins with quiet intent, measuring foundations and tracing the bones of streets with a mix of practical care and reverence. They drafted plans that balanced memory with function, deciding which walls to keep as markers and which spaces to clear for new life and safety. Some buildings were preserved as reminders, their broken outlines left to speak gently of what had been endured and not to be forgotten. Others were cleared to make room for housing, schools, and the gardens communities would plant in years to come. Laborers worked with steady hands, moving stones and salvaging beams, their tasks slow and deliberate like a form of prayer. Women and men who had once repaired machines now mended homes, learning new crafts with patient instruction and passing these skills along. The layout of neighborhoods shifted as needs changed, courtyards turning into places for shared work and children's play. Planners learned to listen to the people who lived there, letting memory guide choices as much as efficiency and economy. The physical reconstruction moved in small communal steps, each one honoring the past while making room for what would come. Artists and poets found their voices among the rubble, and began shaping quiet tributes in paint, stone, and verse that asked to be felt more than proclaimed. Murals appeared on repaired walls, soft colors applied to hard faces, as if to teach the city to breathe in new pigments and to soften the sharp edges of memory. Sculptors worked with salvaged metal and stone, creating markers that refused both triumphalism and erasure, while offering places for quiet reflection. Musicians played low songs in newly opened halls and in cellars, their notes gathering people in ways announcements could never do. Performances were modest and intimate, designed to hold and heal rather than to rally, and they became part of the slow ritual of recovery. Schools reopened in makeshift rooms where teachers read aloud, and children learned to spell and count again, the cadence of lessons restoring a sense of ordinary time. Libraries collected, donated books and journals, creating quiet rooms where people could sit and read in restored calm. Through art and learning, the city cultivated a softer culture that would carry forward lessons of endurance, patience, and shared humanity. Survivors returned to find traces of their lives tucked into walls and under floorboards, little preserves of what had been left behind that felt like messages from another season. A cupboard might contain a jar of preserved fruit, a letter, or a child's drawing, each object a tender link to a life interrupted and now reassembled by memory. Families repaired what they could and buried what they could not, performing private rituals of closure and remembrance that the public record could not fully capture. Graves were marked with names, when known, and with small stones, when names could not be recovered, each one tended with care and a slow, respectful attention. Communities organized memorial days that were gentle and personal, favoring quiet walks and shared meals over grand ceremonies, honoring the particular in the midst of collective grief. People placed small offerings at the base of a preserved wall or near a tree planted in a cleared square, gestures that honored loss and insisted life would continue. These rites of mourning were decentralized and intimate, spread across courtyards and cellars, and the slow rhythm of daily tasks. Some sites later became official memorials, chosen and shaped by testimony, and by the people who lived with memory every day. Those places allowed for both public acknowledgement and private stillness, spaces where remembrance could be visited without prescription. Economies revived slowly as workshops reopened, and markets returned in quieter, more modest form. Each repaired window and reopened stall, a gentle testimony to endurance. Tradespeople fixed tools, merchants negotiated safe routes, and farmers from the surrounding areas brought goods back into the city's pulse. The Volga carried barges again that held grain and timber, its currents resuming the older rhythms of trade and travel that steady cities over time. People relearned barter and small credit systems that helped neighborhoods function when formal banking and larger networks remained fragile. Cooperative efforts emerged where neighbors pooled resources to rebuild shared walls or to plant communal gardens that would feed many. New businesses were modest at first, offering repairs, clothing, or small comforts essential to everyday life, and they grew with the cautious return of steady customers. Economic recovery relied as much on human networks and trust as on materials, neighbors' goodwill proving as valuable as any shipment. Slowly, the hum of commerce returned like a faint melody that had been paused and now resumed on a softer beat. With each repaired window and reopened stall, the city inched closer to a life that preserved hardship without being defined solely by it. In the years that followed, Stalingrad's story spread beyond its banks and into wider memory, taught in schools and spoken in quiet gatherings as a lesson in endurance and consequence. Scholars debated causes and consequences, while survivors told their versions in voices that were both tender and firm, insisting on the human particularity behind larger events. Monuments rose in careful places, chosen to welcome contemplation rather than spectacle, and plaques bore names that insisted on attention to individuals as well as to collective sacrifice. The city itself was renamed in time, its identity reshaped by history, and by the people who chose to remain, rebuild, and remember on their own terms. Visitors came to sit on benches and to listen to guides who knew how to speak with both reverence and honesty, offering space for reflection rather than aggrandizement. Archives gathered letters, photographs, and oral histories, creating detailed maps of lived experience that resisted simplification and honored nuance. Over years, the sharp edges of the event softened in public memory, not because pain was forgotten, but because it was woven into the fabric of daily life and taught through steady, careful rituals. New generations learned lessons of endurance through stories, school curricula, and the quiet presence of preserved sites that invited private thought. Memory work continued as an act of civic care, ensuring the past was neither used to inflame nor to obscure the complexity of human lives. Among the stones, memory began to rebuild what life could not. The Volga returned to being a slow voice, its surface smoothing out the scars of winter and war like a hand tracing an old map. Boats drifted again with cautious purpose, their wakes small and polite, undoing in water what had been troubled in air and earth. Fishermen mended nets by the riverbank, their movements patient and sure as if practicing a long-forgotten prayer of routine. Children watched from the softened edges of quays, skipping stones that made bright, small disturbances on an otherwise steady mirror. The city's ruins receded into the eye like memories that had been lived and then put away on a high shelf. People walked along embankments in pairs or alone, finding new patterns of movement that blended mourning with the practical habits of daily life. Gardens were planted in cleared courtyards, tiny green promises against the grey, each seed a decision for a future that included both sorrow and fruit. The water carried these small acts downstream, indifferent and steady, reminding those who watched that flow itself is a form of memory. And as the river moved, it seemed to gather fragments of story and return them in a slow, calm rhythm that soothed more than it answered. In spring, the Volga widened in tone and color, and the city learned to read the subtle changes of its surface as one reads a familiar voice. Barges returned with wood and grain, and the sound of loading and unloading resumed with the discreet confidence of normal commerce. Market stalls reappeared along streets once skeletal, offering small comforts and goods that stitched neighborhoods together again. Women and men exchanged news and recipes, and the cautious jokes that come when people test the safety of each other's presence. Memorials were created in courtyards and on squares, simple stones, engraved plaques, and gardens planted around survivors' names. These places were not temples of noise, but gentle rooms for reflection, where small rituals could be performed in private or in soft groups. Schools opened their doors to children who had learned different lessons than any textbook could teach, and teachers adapted by building lessons around both facts and feeling. Libraries filled with donated books, and with the careful records of what had been lived, offering future readers both detail and context. Through the routines of growing and teaching, the city began to turn the page while keeping the margins annotated by memory. The people who stayed behind became stewards of both ruin and renewal, learning crafts and trades that braided recovery into daily practice. Masons relearned lost techniques while inventing new ones that fit patched walls and repaired arches. Women led cooperative kitchens and small factories, converting the hard labor of survival into work that sustained more than a single household. Men who had once been soldiers put their skill into rebuilding bridges and clearing roads, finding in motion a quiet redemption Neighborhood councils formed to allocate scarce resources fairly, planting seeds of civic life in places that had been hollowed by conflict. Volunteers walked the streets to collect stories and names, creating records that would resist the drift of forgetfulness. In the afternoons, people met at river cafes and benches to trade news and to find companionship, the simple exchange of conversation, a balm for long silences. Trades resumed, markets hummed, and the city's economy moved from ration to renewal in small, deliberate steps. And through all this practical revival, memory was honored not as an obstacle to living, but as a companion to rebuilding. Artists and writers gathered fragments of experience and turned them into small acts of public care that asked citizens to remember softly and honestly. Murals appeared on newly smoothed walls, their colors not loud, but chosen to soothe and to hold attention in the gentle way a hand holds a cup. Poets read in converted cellars, their verses weaving ordinary details, a kettle's whistle, a child's laugh, into the large fabric of endurance and consequence. Sculptors worked with salvaged metal to form markers that resisted triumph and promoted reflection, offering places where individuals could sit and think rather than pose and applaud. Musicians organized small concerts, whose notes stitched neighborhoods back together in a sonic kind of repair. Public readings and quiet exhibitions became ways to teach younger generations about both courage and the cost of it. These cultural acts were modest and human, avoiding spectacle in favor of intimacy, and they helped the city to grieve in ways that were personal and communal at once. Young people learned that remembering could be creative and generative, a way to honor without being trapped by the past. Through culture, the city found softer languages for its own history. Institutions arrived to help with practical tasks of recovery, bringing engineers, doctors, and planners who balanced technical skill with respect for lived experience. Hospitals rebuilt wards and trained new staff, teaching them how to soothe as well as to cure. Architects worked with residents to decide which ruins should remain as memory and which should be transformed into housing, gardens, or schools. Reconstruction was approached as conversation rather than command. Plans were shaped by the people who would live with them, blending efficiency with dignity. Aid came with paper and practice, lists, permits, blueprints, and the patient work of translating need into sustainable projects. Volunteers coordinated seed distributions, carpentry workshops, and literacy drives, turning charity into capacity building. Over months and years, neighborhoods regained color and function, and the rhythm of ordinary life resumed with a softer tempo. The Volga continued to ferry goods and people, quietly facilitating a return to interdependence that cities rely upon. In the daily work of rebuilding, the moral lessons of Stalingrad were folded into practical wisdom about how to care for people at scale. Families rebuilt private rituals that kept memory alive without letting it consume the possibility of joy. Kitchens once emptied by siege again smelled of baking, a scent that made ordinary mornings feel holy in small ways. Grandparents shared stories with grandchildren not to frighten them, but to teach the value of resilience, the art of mending, and the practice of looking after one another. Weddings, baptisms, and simple neighborhood gatherings resumed with an extra tenderness that credited survival as a shared achievement. Small acts of remembrance, leaving a single candle at a preserved wall, planting a tree in a courtyard, became part of the civic grammar that taught children to value both past and present. People learned to answer the question of memory with practical care, tending a garden, teaching a trade, preserving a story. The city was not rebuilt into its former self, but into a new life that acknowledged loss while claiming the dignity of renewal. Private rituals and public duties braided together into the social fabric that would hold later generations. And in that braided life, the river's steady movement became a metaphor for both remembrance and progress. Years later, visitors would come to walk the embankments and to listen to guides who spoke with quiet authority about what had been and what had been learnt. They would sit by memorials and read the names etched there, feeling the hush of careful attention that such places ask for. School children would gather for lessons that combined history with ethics, learning how human choices ripple across generations. Scholars would debate causes and consequences in language that strove for nuance rather than certainty, and families would continue to teach the intimate stories the textbooks could not convey. The city's identity changed steadily, shaped by those who chose to remain and those who returned to rebuild, even as it welcomed newcomers who carried fresh perspectives and hands willing to work. Memory did not ossify into myth, but remained a living practice that breathed through public rituals, art, and the quiet labor of everyday life. The Volga itself kept its own counsel, moving past the rebuilt docks and the preserved walls, as if carrying a long conversation. And travelers who paused at its banks often felt the river's capacity to listen and to hold what people brought to its edge. Among those who walked the embankments, the city's scars read as lessons more than as wounds. In the last hush of this long story, the city learned a final, gentle lesson about endurance. It learned that remembrance must be tender and precise, honoring specifics rather than folding everything into a single grand narrative. It learned that rebuilding is not an act of forgetting, but of choosing how memory will live alongside new days. People discovered that the simplest acts, sharing bread, teaching a child to read, tending a garden, were profound ways to answer history with life. Communities agreed that monuments should invite reflection, not triumph, and that education must teach both facts and the moral work of caring. Over time, the urgency of survival softened into the steady obligations of citizenship to tend, to remember, and to teach. The river continued to flow, a long, patient witness to seasons of loss and seasons of repair. In its movement, it carried both the city's weight of sorrow and its small, enduring joys. The river still flows past the city they called Stalingrad, carrying not victory nor defeat, but the quiet memory of what it means to endure.